Habitat, Episode 2, Chapter 1. Nolan felt the gaze of the watcher before he saw it lurking above in the shadowy branches. He kneeled ankle-deep in a gently flowing stream, focused on the rippling water, fishing for dinner. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as his peripheral vision caught a fleeting glimpse of an indistinct figure concealed deep in the shadows of the dense jungle canopy. The thick foliage of the mysterious habitat stretched around him, a green canopy that filtered the sunlight into a perpetual dusk. In this strange jungle, every shadow could conceal a new mystery or a new threat. Nolan gripped his makeshift spear, turning his head to pinpoint the source of the unsettling sensation of being watched. The weapon, crude yet effective, was cobbled together with a blade made from shrapnel taken from the crashed spacecraft that had left Nolan and their crew stranded within the habitat. The jungle's silence was oppressive, the only sound the gentle murmur of the stream and the occasional call of an unseen creature, a sound both eerily familiar and unsettlingly foreign. Then he saw it, a figure, vague and indistinct, perched silently on a thick branch almost 3 stories above the jungle floor. A vaguely humanoid silhouette. It stood so still it was as if the surrounding tree limbs had grown to envelop it. Nolan narrowed his eyes, straining to discern whether it was one of the habitat's animal inhabitants or if it could be a person. A chill ran down his spine, despite the humid air clinging to his skin. The watcher stood on 2 legs, a shadow melding with the gnarled limbs of the jungle's giants. Its stillness was unnerving, as if it were as much a part of the landscape as the trees themselves. Without taking his gaze off the ominous shape, Nolan withdrew his feet from the stream and edged towards the muddy bank, where his makeshift pack sat next to 2 fish he had already caught. His mind raced, questioning if fatigue and stress were causing him to imagine the figure in the dim habitat light beneath the jungle canopy. Then the first fat raindrop landed with a splat beside him, its impact on the stream's surface sending out ripples into the current. It was followed by another that smacked into his face, cold and startling. As he slid his feet into his boots, his gaze stayed fixed on the ominous figure in the shadows. The sky tore open with the abrupt fury of a hurricane. Rain, heavy and relentless, obliterated the view, turning the world into a blur of green and gray. He whipped his head around at a loud snap from the underbrush behind him, swinging the spear reflexively. Nothing but leaves and ferns dancing violently under the pounding torrent. He swiveled his gaze back up to the mysterious watcher's perch. The branch was empty. It was as if whatever had been there had vanished into the jungle's heart. Nolan's mind raced with possibilities, but another urgent sound shattered the moment. This one different, desperate, and unmistakably human. Before Nolan could ponder further, the jungle erupted with a crash of snapping branches. His crewmate Richard Doyle exploded out of the dense foliage, sprinting headlong toward Nolan, bellowing, "Go! Go! Go!" Mud splattered his clothes as his boots pounded the wet earth. Adrenaline surged through Nolan's veins like liquid fire. "What's happening?" he called back, moving to meet Doyle's frantic pace. Doyle's expression was wild, eyes wide with primal fear. "They're right behind me," he said between gasping breaths. Propelled into motion by instinct, Nolan fell in behind Doyle. He risked a glance backward, glimpsing shapes, animals, giving chase, weaving with disturbing speed through the undergrowth. Nolan's lungs burned as he pushed forward into the suffocating humidity, the ground beneath them a treacherous mix of mud and slick leaves. The rain was an unrelenting curtain of water that blurred the boundary between earth and sky, turning their escape into a desperate blind dash through nature's gauntlet. Nolan careened after Doyle, feet sliding over rain-slickened roots and stones, threatening to pitch him face first into the mud. Lungs burning, he shouted over the cacophony of the storm. "What are they? Wolves? Feral dogs? Heck if I know." Doyle's reply was almost lost to the wind, his breaths coming in sharp, ragged pulls. "But they're the biggest frickin' canines I've ever seen." Spurred on by Doyle's warning, they tore through the dense jungle, the very real threat snapping at their heels. The creatures wove between massive tree trunks with disturbing speed, closing the gap. Nolan and Doyle crashed through the undergrowth, hands raised to shield their faces from whipping vines and branches. The sodden earth sucked at their feet, threatening to send them sprawling with each frantic step. "We've got to lose them," Doyle grunted as he hurdled a fallen log. His chest heaved with exertion. Nolan's mind raced, evaluating options even as he dodged tangled thickets and hanging vines. "Where can we go? The beach?" Doyle shook his head, not breaking stride. "Too far. They're all around us." To emphasize his point, an ear-splitting cacophony of baying and snarling erupted from the trees behind them. The frenzied sounds bounced off the dense foliage, making the beasts seem omnipresent. Nolan's focus snapped to the rushing stream on their right, swollen by the heavy rains. "If we can cross the water, they might not follow." Doyle's reply was lost as Nolan hit an unseen obstacle, his boot catching on a twisted root. He sprawled forward, throwing his hands out just in time to avoid face-planting in the muck. One of the snarling creatures burst from the undergrowth, frothing jaws gaping wide as it pounced. Nolan's reflexes took over. He twisted and lashed out with his boot, catching the beast under its jaw. The kick knocked it aside, buying precious seconds for Nolan to lurch upright and bolt after Doyle. The creatures surrounded them on all sides, flowing through the jungle like a tightening noose. Doyle leaped over a downed tree while Nolan hurdled it in pursuit. The lead dog was back on his heels, snapping jaws eager to take him down. "Can't cross here," Nolan yelled through heaving breaths over the storm's din as the rushing stream roared along their right flank. The current was too wide and strong, an impassable barrier, swollen with the torrential downfall from the storm. His eyes scanned the shoreline, hunting an escape. As they stood at the edge of the tumultuous river, their hearts raced, knowing they were backed into a dead end. Beside him, Doyle dropped to one knee, gaze fixed on the advancing pack. Nolan stole a glance down and saw Doyle heft a rock the size of a grapefruit, palm cupping the smooth surface as he gauged its weight. Doyle made eye contact with Nolan, tipping his chin at the lead dog, now crouched and ready to charge. "Get ready," he said, wrist coiling. "Go on 3. 1, 2. The rest of his countdown was lost as Doyle's powerful throw sent the stone rocketing through the rain-soaked air. It caught the lead dog in the shoulder with a thud, sending the beast reeling. "Go now!" Doyle bellowed. They both took off, sprinting towards the momentary gap in the snarling pack as the creatures swarmed their dazed leader. Nolan grimaced as he felt wicked jaws clamp onto his pant leg, but he pulled free with a desperate kick and kept running. "We've got to cross," he shouted to Doyle over the cacophony of frenzied baying. "Watch for a narrow point." Already he could feel his strength fading, his limbs growing heavy as his pace slowed. He hurdled a moss-slick log, and his boot snagged on impact, sending him crashing down face first. Before he could react, one of the savage beasts was upon him, rancid breath hot on his neck as it went for his throat. Desperation flooded Nolan's veins with adrenaline. He twisted, grappling until his hands closed around a thick branch. With a guttural cry, he rammed it sideways into the creature's mouth, gagging its bite mere inches from his jugular. Rough hands grabbed Nolan's shoulders, dragging him back from the brink as Doyle hauled him to his feet. Together they scrambled on, the creatures right on their heels, their savage bays and snarls mingling with the roar of the rushing water. The very terrain seemed to shift against them now, the ridge on their left rising ever higher, while the stream kept them hemmed in along the right. Doyle gave voice to Nolan's own thoughts in a clipped bark. "They're forcing us into a chute. No way back." Escape seemed impossible, but Doyle yelled out, pointing downstream. "There! I think I see a place we can cross." He turned to wave Nolan ahead just as his boot hit a slick patch of mud. Doyle's arms pinwheeled wildly and his feet flew out from under him and he hurtled forward, flailing for Nolan as he fell. Nolan reacted, honed reflexes grabbing for his crewmate, desperately trying to anchor them, despite the lack of solid purchase. It was in vain. The mud offered no grip, and together they slid, a tangle of limbs and muted curses, down the embankment. Nolan's world became a whirl. his body a pawn to gravity's merciless pull. The jungle became a spinning kaleidoscope of greens and browns as they hurtled down the gully. They careened down the slippery embankment, Nolan clawing for any purchase. He glimpsed the void too late, a gaping sinkhole yawning open mere feet ahead. With a bone-jarring impact, he spilled onto solid ground, mud slicking his arms and face. Nolan blinked against debris. He watched Doyle hit the sinkhole rim. Arms flailing, Doyle vanished, screaming over the edge into darkness. Doyle! The name tore from Nolan's raw throat. He scrambled up and flung himself belly down at the pit's crumbling lip. He peered over the precipice, searching the gloom for any sign of his crewmate. Nolan gazed over the sinkhole's mossy edge, spotting Doyle treading water far below in an underground lake that was an inescapable natural prison. He was gazing up at Nolan with an uncharacteristic helplessness that pierced his steely composure. There was no clear path back up the sheer walls. He was stuck in this sunken natural cathedral of stone. If it had not been for their current situation, Nolan would have been in awe of this place's natural beauty. Doyle, are you okay down there? Far below floated up a slew of creative expletives, followed by a pained response. Oh, definitely peachy. Doyle coughed harshly. Just enjoying my new watery grave. Apart from this grand underground lake, everything's fantastic. Nolan surveyed the sinkhole. Tree roots and clinging vegetation revealed its incredible age. Is there any way out? Can you climb? Doyle's strained laugh echoed. Climb? No way. Sheer walls on all sides. It's a fancy dungeon with a skylight. His voice broke. How the heck am I supposed to get out of here? Chapter 2. About an hour later, Nolan ran through the dense underbrush of the jungle, moving as quickly as the damp ground would allow. Vines and broad leaves slapped against his face and arms as he pushed through the thick foliage. His boots sank into deep mud, making wet sucking sounds. He focused on the tree trunks where he had left smears of mud to guide himself back to the sinkhole where he had left Doyle about an hour earlier. A metal case he carried banged rhythmically against Nolan's thigh as he ran, the supplies inside shuddering with each long stride. His lungs burned and a sharp stitch needled at his side, but he pushed harder, ignoring the pain. The echo of Doyle's strained voice rang in his memory, spurring Nolan to pick up the pace. Up ahead, the trees parted into a small clearing nestled within a depression in the rugged topography. At its center yawned the dark and gaping maw of the sinkhole, an ominous void amongst the vibrant greens of the habitat jungle. Nolan slowed as he reached the clearing's edge, his breath heaving in his chest. He set the case down and called into the opening. Doyle, are you still okay down there? Nolan waited, eyes trained at the sinkhole. After a few seconds, Doyle's voice echoed up from the shadowy depths. Nolan, please tell me you have a way to get me out of here. Rather than Doyle's usual bravado, his tone held an edge of true desperation. Nolan stood several feet from the jagged edge, peering down into the dark pit. Far below, a shaft of light illuminated the surface of the underground lake, where Doyle still tread water. The distance was too great to drop a rope, and the sheer rock walls revealed no easy purchase for climbing. I'm working on it. Just hang in there a little longer, Nolan said. Even from high above, Nolan could hear how erratic Doyle's paddling had become. Come on, man. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The water's so freaking cold. Nolan looked down at his Epocera watch, an hour and 12 minutes, since he had sprinted off towards the beach. He still had a few hours until Habitat's illumination cycle would transition into its night phase. Nolan worked quickly in the mid-afternoon light, popping open the survival kit and unfurled a tightly bound package from within its compartments. I need you to hang on, Doyle. I've got something here that should help you. Nolan monitored the pit as he unrolled the bundle, revealing a compressed tank of carbon dioxide paired with a wrapped bundle of heavy polyurethane fabric. He twisted the valve on the pressurized tank, releasing a jet of cold gas into the folded material. As the CO2 inflated the interior bladders, the bundle expanded into a compact emergency life raft. About the size of a twin mattress, it had durable outer edges lined with thick tubing and a taut middle section meant for sitting. Nolan hefted the inflated raft and stood, making his way slowly towards the sinkhole's ragged edge. Loose stones shifted under his boots, each step precarious. Easy now. Nice and slow, Nolan whispered to himself, inching the raft closer. Without warning, the soil beneath his right foot crumbled away. He felt a surge of weightlessness as dirt and stone fell away into darkness. Nolan gasped as he tumbled. His balance wavered, trying to compensate. Eyes growing wide, Nolan realized he was still clutching the life raft in both hands as he began sliding feet first over the pit's precipice. In desperate reflex, Nolan released the raft and clawed at the sinkhole's rim, even as loose gravel and soil poured over him. Behind, he glimpsed the neon yellow of the raft tumbling end over end into the pit. Turning back, Nolan's fingers tore through roots and burrowed into the crumbling soil. He caught hold of a thick root, his slide halted violently, his shoulder wrenched in its socket. Nolan cried out, the lower half of his body dangling in the open air. Nolan tightened his desperate grip, dirt raining down around him. The shadows of the sinkhole yawned below. He could feel the root already loosening in the sheer earth. He kicked his legs, trying to swing himself upward over the ledge. But the overhang was too high. Far below, Doyle's panicked shouts echoed upwards. Nolan? What in the world is happening up there? Nolan grimaced against a fiery pain in his shoulder and strained to pull himself upward with his good arm. But the sudden torque proved too much. With a crack, the stubborn root ripped free from the soil. For a heart-stopping moment, Nolan found himself sliding over the final inches of the precipice, plunging into darkness, before one flailing hand caught hold of an outcropping of tough grass. Nolan gritted his teeth, assessing his precarious position. Slowly, agonizingly, he dragged himself upwards by degrees, the rock edge scraping against his chest and thighs. He could feel sections crumbling under his palms already. He glanced down once more, vaguely registering that Doyle had climbed onto the emergency raft. Nolan steeled himself. Gnarled roots pockmarked the edges. He flexed his aching fingers, hugging himself closer to the surface. Nolan spotted a likely handhold, releasing one palm and flung his hand upwards, only for the root to snap off in his grip almost instantly. He grunted, nearly losing his grip. More debris rained down towards Doyle, who sputtered with sarcasm. Nolan methodically pulled himself upwards, hand over hand. Minutes stretched on as Nolan painstakingly dragged himself up. All of his will focused on finding the next handhold, and the next. His muscles quivered against the strain. Ragged breaths hissed through clenched teeth. Nolan steadily ascended the pit's perimeter, wary to glance downwards. After what felt like hours, the soil beneath Nolan's seeking hands turned from crumbling dust to stubborn clumps of grass and clay. With a final heave, he managed to hook a knee over the ledge and crested the sinkhole rim. He clawed forwards, letting loose a scream of relief and agony, before collapsing onto solid ground some distance from the hole. Nolan sprawled, limp. His chest heaved with exertion, still buzzing with adrenaline. After allowing himself a few moments of hard-won rest, he rose unsteadily to his hands and knees. "Yo there, Rocky?" Doyle's echo drifted up. "Epic moves up there, man. But, as much as I appreciate the raft and all, how much would it cost me to trade up for the elevator package?" Nolan barked a strained laugh into the dirt as he caught his breath. At least Doyle still had his sense of humor. But time was running out. They needed a proper plan to get Doyle out of the sinkhole. Nolan rolled over with a groan, mind racing as he racked his brain for ideas. Chapter 3. Nolan spent the next few hours in a busy rush against daylight. After using the radio to call in an update to Grace and Eva, he hiked back to their location at the beach. Together they broke down their camp and moved their few supplies to the sinkhole. The trek back took longer than Nolan had expected because Grace was limping, grimacing with each step. "How's the leg?" Nolan asked her, noticing her labored movements. "Hurts like hell, but I'll manage." A few days earlier, Grace had been attacked by an angry, eel-like creature while trying to swim away from the sinking wreckage of their Ranger 4 spacecraft after it had crash-landed on the habitat. The infection from the bite wound had progressively worsened despite Ava's medical efforts. They trudged on in silence through the dense jungle. The habitat's artificial sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns, casting long shadows over the landscape. As they made their way between the massive trees, Nolan felt a growing unease. The hairs on his neck prickled with the sense he was being watched from the shadows. He scanned the surroundings, but saw nothing amiss in the lush green foliage. When they arrived at the sinkhole's edge, 30 minutes later, Doyle was in better spirits, sitting on his makeshift raft, singing an off-key sea shanty. His voice echoed up from the watery abyss. "Ahoy there," he called out with a grin, hearing them approach. "Seems like my dinner plans fell through. Literally. You think you could manage some kind of food drop for a hungry spelunker down here?" Nolan checked his watch and estimated he had enough time for another errand before daylight faded. "I'm going to head back to the stream where I was fishing earlier," he told the others. "See if I can find everything I left behind. I'll be back as soon as I can." Eva nodded, not looking up from rummaging through her med kit, taking inventory of their dwindling medical supplies. Nolan retraced his steps along the path to the place he had been fishing before Doyle rushed out of the woods with the wild canines chasing him. As he approached the fishing spot, he found the makeshift spear in the underbrush and felt a small bit better with the weapon in his hand. Then, at the fishing location, what he found surprised him. His pack and its meager contents were strewn across the mossy shore next to the river. His folding knife, parachute cord, a few makeshift tools. Strangely, though, the fish he had caught were untouched, still laying on the bank of the river. As Nolan set to work gathering his items, an uneasy feeling came over him, raising the hairs on his arms. He couldn't help but look up into the branches of the canopy, half expecting to see the shadowy figure had returned to watch him. But the branches above were empty. Nolan took stock of his repacked gear, a sinking feeling coming over him. There was still something missing: his personal photographs from home, the only mementos that had survived the crash of their Ranger shuttle. He spent 10 more minutes searching the underbrush, but found nothing. Twilight approached by the time Nolan returned to the sinkhole. He found Eva kneeling next to Grace, attending to her injured leg by firelight. Grace winced as Eva cleaned and redressed the wound, which wept with infection despite her efforts. Far below, Doyle floated listlessly on his raft in the dark water. "Any luck?" Eva asked, glancing up. Nolan held up the 2 exotic fish speared on sticks. "Yeah, I guess. Found my pack ransacked, but the fish untouched. It's like something wanted to go through my gear but didn't care about the food." Eva looked puzzled. Very strange. She secured the new bandage on Grace's leg. "Try to stay off it as much as possible. The infection is getting worse." Grace nodded, then turned to Nolan. "While you were gone, Doyle tried to climb up those vines hanging down into the sinkhole 3 times. Same result each time. The vines won't hold him. We're going to need a better way to get him out." "I think I have an idea," Nolan said. "You can help me gather what we need." He described his plan to construct a rope ladder from parachute cord and the habitat's abundant bamboo-like vegetation. "We don't have much parachute cord left, but it might be enough to get us halfway down," he said. "If Doyle can meet us in the middle, it just might work." Grace looked skeptical, but agreed to help, not seeing any better options. She heaved herself up with a stifled groan and headed off into the woods to cut bamboo shafts. Nolan watched her limp away, wincing as she faded from sight. "That leg's looking real bad," he said to Eva. She busied herself stoking the small fire. The infection spread up past her knee. She's on a cocktail of what few antibiotics I still have from the Ranger's med kit. I'm doing what I can. "She seems to be taking a lot of meds for the pain, too," Nolan observed. "No, I haven't given her anything for pain," Eva said with a frown. I used the last of the opioid injections 2 days ago on Annika. Nolan's brow furrowed as he recalled the handfuls of pills he'd seen Grace routinely dry swallow over the past 48 hours. She must have been self-medicating with something she had hidden away. Before long, Grace returned, dragging several cut bamboo poles. Nolan set to work measuring and cutting them to appropriate lengths with his folding knife. The habitat's sunlight gradually faded as its night cycle began, bathing their camp in darkness. Eva prepared a makeshift spit to cook the fish over the fire's orange glow. Eva portioned out the fish onto large leaves, makeshift plates that held their simple dinner. She wrapped and secured Doyle's portion with a vine. With a careful motion, Eva tossed it into the sinkhole, Doyle's thanks echoing up to them. As they ate, the conversation shifted to their next moves. Nolan broached one of his earlier ideas about returning to the ancient crumbling city they had visited after crashing. We need to head back there. Scout it out properly, he said between bites of the rich, flaky fish. Could be shelter or supplies we can use. Not until we find Annika, Grace countered, shaking another few pills from a small bottle into her palm. She's out there alone. If she's even still alive, we can't abandon her. Didn't you say her condition meant she needed constant meds and care? Nolan asked Eva. We've searched for 2 days. How long could she survive without your treatment? Eva stared at the crackling flames. It's unlikely she would still be alive unless... Her voice trailed off. Unless what? Nolan prodded. When she disappeared that night, I saw something take her. I don't really know how to describe it. I didn't get a good look. It was like it wasn't totally there, just a hint of a shape, almost like a blurry shadow. She hesitated, seeming disturbed. But it was big. Very big. I feel like I sound crazy. Chills ran down Nolan's spine, recalling the tall silhouette of the watcher he'd glimpsed from afar just that morning, seemingly observing him. I don't think you sound crazy, Nolan assured her. When I was fishing earlier, I saw something stalking me from a tree. It was tall. I couldn't make out any details in the shadows, but it was definitely watching me. Eva glanced up, her eyes reflective pools in the firelight. What if something or someone has her? Grace shook her head. No way. We would have spotted signs of indigenous inhabitants by now. The habitat's overgrown jungle and abandoned ruins suggest this place was abandoned long before we crashed here. Nolan remained silent as he turned over these disparate pieces of a confounding puzzle. They needed more information to understand what they were dealing with. But Grace was right about one thing. They couldn't leave Annika behind. The noises of the jungle, insects, night birds, rustling plants, seemed amplified and ominous. Finishing the last flavorful bites of fish, Nolan turned his attention back to the bamboo poles. We'll keep working on this ladder overnight. Come morning, we'll lower it through the opening and try again. The others murmured agreement. I think we need to take shifts tonight. Keep a watch out, Nolan continued, stoking the fire with a stick. Too many strange happenings lately. Between the feral canines, the strange figure that was watching me, and whatever took Annika away, we need to be vigilant. Grace nodded, stifling a yawn. I can take first shift. Doubt I'll sleep much anyway with this leg. Nolan studied her wan, sweat-sheened face, doubting she was up for sentry duty in her condition. But he knew better than to undermine her capability. If you start fading, wake one of us for next watch, he said. A heaviness descended on the group as they stared at the flickering flames. Nolan reached into his back pocket and pulled out his harmonica. Mind if I play us something? He asked, no one in particular. When no one objected, he lifted the harmonica to his lips and began to play a soulful blues number. As the plaintive notes echoed into the night, he poured all their shared hopes, fears, into the song. The harmonica's cries cut through the jungle. Nolan expertly navigated the emotive scales, each note a soulful call into the night. The rhythm ebbed and flowed compellingly, capturing their longing and determination. As the last melancholic note of Nolan's harmonica faded into the dark, a tense hush fell over the group. Their weary faces glowed in the firelight as they each retreated into silent contemplation. "What's it called?" Eva finally asked. "The song." Nolan smiled. "Help Me by Sonny Boy Williamson." Nolan's thoughts went to Annika, out there lost and ailing if she was still alive. Guilt tugged at him that they had not gone after her yet. This mission was supposed to herald a new dawn for humanity, pioneering the furthest reaches of space. Instead, it had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival in this mystifying habitat. Their dreams of the future now lay strewn in the wreckage, much like their shuttle, ragged hopes sinking into oblivion. Grace's sudden gasp shattered the reverie. Nolan's head snapped up to see her staring wide-eyed over his shoulder, face drained of color. He spun around, muscles tensed for action. There, perched at the base of the dense foliage of a nearby tree, loomed the shadowy visage of the tall, watching figure, its features indiscernible in the darkness. Nolan's breath stalled in his throat. Rather than menace, its posture seemed to be studying them. Then, in a rustle of leaves, their silent watcher receded into the woods. The gloom swallowed its retreating form until only lingering questions filled its wake. "What the heck was that?" Grace whispered. "I think it's been tracking us." "Studying our movements," Eva said. "But I don't believe its intentions are malicious, merely observant." Nolan kept his eyes pinned to the last spot he saw their lurking pursuer. His mind raced with this new variable added to their predicament. "I need to go after it," he said, rising. Eva reached out to halt him with a firm grip on his forearm. "No, don't. I don't think it's just any animal. It seems to be intelligent." "So what then? We just sit around here waiting?" Frustration roughened his tone. "No, we focus on getting rest tonight and getting Doyle out tomorrow," Eva replied. "Our priorities stay the same. Secure basic necessities first and keep looking for Annika." "And if that thing wanted to hurt us," Grace said, "it's had plenty of chances." Nolan peered into the dark foliage, hoping to catch another glimpse of the watcher. Instead, a glint of light snatched his attention, something reflecting the dying fire's glow. He approached, and there, wedged amidst the gnarled roots, were his missing photographs. Nolan lifted them, baffled. The one on top showed him years ago, sitting in his beloved Cessna cockpit, sunlight glinting off the ocean miles below as he flew through the deep blue sky. That lost world now seemed a lifetime away. Had the Watcher meant to return these mementos? Around him, the habitat's shadows deepened, concealing any revelations. With more questions than answers, Nolan returned to the fireside, photos in hand. Chapter 4. 1981. About 18 months before the launch of the ARGO mission, Nolan gazed out the window of his Cessna, taking in the sprawling vista of palm dunes' picturesque Florida coastline. He leaned into the wind, savoring the rush of air as he piloted the plane high above the waves. The late morning sun glinted off the turquoise waves below, the white sand beaches dotted with colorful umbrellas shielding tourists from the summer heat. He enjoyed these long banner-towing runs, a peaceful respite high above the earth, unencumbered by worldly worries. The Slusho advertisement flapped loudly behind the plane, reminding Nolan this was still a job. The banner fluttering behind the plane cast shadows that rippled over golden sands, filled with hundreds of beachgoers basking in the summer sun. Children built sandcastles decorated with shells, teens played volleyball with carefree laughter, and couples strolled by the water's edge, lost in quiet conversation. Further out, surfers paddled into the frothing waves, while lone paddlers in kayaks glided across calmer turquoise waters. Nolan's eyes followed the meandering line where sand gave way to sea, the rhythmic dance of waves and tides revealing and concealing seashell treasures left behind. Memories of his childhood flashed through his mind, collecting delicate sand dollars and starfish. A pang of nostalgic longing surprised him. Palm Dunes was always this way in the summer. alive with activity, yet unhurried, an encapsulation of seaside tranquility. The radio crackled, jolting Nolan from his musing. Cessna 795, Palm Tower. You're required back at base. It was the familiar gravelly voice of Hank Porter, a local air traffic controller. Nolan frowned, glancing at his watch. Palm Tower, I've still got 40 minutes of ad time left on this slusho run, Nolan radioed back. Take it up when you land, Rocket Man. Priority request for your return. Clear to land runway 18. When you get done playing billboard up there, get yourself back to the airfield, Hank replied. His tone was casual, but Nolan detected an undercurrent of curiosity. Roger that, Palm Tower, Nolan replied, puzzled but compliant. Banking gently, he aimed the nose of the plane towards land, giving the tourists below one final glimpse of the fluttering banner. He could not imagine what urgent matter required his unscheduled return. Nolan frowned, his brow furrowing. An important visitor for him? At the airfield? He ran through options in his mind, but came up blank. With a shake of his head, he guided the Cessna east toward Palm Dunes Airfield, nestled amid the low pine forests and farmland. Who could possibly be looking for him, and why? His life these days was predictable, a far cry from the chaos of his former roles. As Nolan approached his home base, he could see the long runway slicing a path through vibrant, green pastures. Several vintage planes were scattered around the main hangar, glinting silver in the midday sun. He also noticed with surprise what looked like a larger-than-normal crowd gathered around the small parking area. He squinted against the sunlight, unable to make out faces, but saw perhaps 36 people clustered together facing the main hangar doors. Multiple large news video cameras on tripods were evident. What the heck is going on down there? Nolan wondered aloud. This was highly irregular at the normally sleepy airfield. He banked the Cessna into a wide, sweeping turn to line up for landing, clicking on the radio to advise Hank he was on final approach. At 1,000 feet, he yanked hard on a lever, releasing the long banner from its anchor points at the tail. It detached and fluttered wildly before landing in a farmer's field far from the runway. Nolan skimmed low over the treetops, catching sight of the crowd again, realizing now they were reporters with microphones and notepads. Several familiar faces from Palm Dunes stood among them, along with a man in a finely tailored suit Nolan didn't recognize. He checked his coordinates, maneuvering the Cessna into a textbook curve towards final approach. As he passed the tower, Nolan spotted Hank speaking to visitors instead of overseeing runway operations. Another anomaly to add to the morning's mystery. Lining up for landing, Nolan spied the controllers neglecting duties to stare skyward at his descending plane. Before he could process this further, the runway threshold was rushing up to meet him. With a smooth, practiced motion, honed over thousands of hours aloft, he flared the aircraft and settled onto the tarmac. Nolan taxied slowly toward the gathered crowd, his pulse quickening at the strange scene unfolding through his plexiglass cocoon. The spectators began rushing toward the Cessna, camera operators hoisting equipment onto shoulders to follow. Nolan swallowed hard as he coasted the last 100 yards to parking, a growing unease creeping into his thoughts. Just as the propeller stopped spinning, an unfamiliar man with an impossibly white smile yanked open the passenger door. "Nolan Beckett, great to meet you. I'm Trevor Hall with GNN News and we are coming to you live. How does it feel to be one of 5 civilians selected for the ARGO mission?" The man shouted over the din of the crowd, pressing closer. Blinding television lights illuminated Nolan's confused features. Despite the warmth of the Florida sun, Nolan suddenly felt chilled. His breath seemed to halt in his chest as he struggled to process Hall's words. The ARGO mission, civilian selection, live on TV. He hadn't applied. He knew all about Project ARGO, of course. Who hadn't since the Bentham anomaly made recent headlines? But civilian selection was months away, and Nolan certainly hadn't thrown his name in the candidate pool. Oblivious to Nolan's internal crisis, the pushy GNN reporter kept pressing for a reaction, sticking his microphone toward Nolan's face. The cameras pushed in as whispers rippled through the crowd. Nolan gripped the edge of the pilot seat, his knuckles turning white. He felt trapped, unable to move or form words. How is this happening? I... I'm sorry. I think there's some mistake, Nolan stammered. I didn't actually apply for... No need for modesty, Trevor Hall interjected smoothly, with a wink at his viewers. We've all been learning about your legendary piloting skills. Seems like you're the ideal candidate for this history-making voyage. Nolan shook his head, numb. He scanned the expectant faces boxing his plane in place on the tarmac, desperate for an escape from this bizarre situation. A few familiar locals behind the cameras gave him thumbs-up gestures and mouthed congratulations. This was all wrong. He needed to get away and figure out what was happening. With trembling hands, he unbuckled his harness and eased himself from the cockpit. Trevor maintained a white-knuckled grip on his arm, continuing to pepper him with questions as Nolan squeezed through clinging onlookers toward the hangar door. He felt short of breath, anxiety rising. Was he on the verge of passing out? Nolan's thoughts raced, struggling to process the reality this stranger described. His chest constricted under the scrutiny of the cameras. He needed air, eyes darting wildly across suffocating bodies and blinding camera lights. He spotted an escape, the hangar's side door. With a final desperate shove, Nolan broke free and stumbled into the relative quiet of the hangar's office. He slammed the metal door against the advancing horde and fumbled a lock into place with quivering fingers. As the din from outside faded, his racing heart slowed. Back against the door, Nolan slid down the smooth metal surface until he was sitting, head in hands. Through the door, he could still hear the reporter's traveling voice extolling, "A true hometown hero. A testament to Palm Dunes' community spirit." "What in heaven's name is happening?" he muttered into the empty room. His own voice echoed back from the television screen across the small office. GNN was running B-roll footage of Nolan's military days, while Trevor described his apparently legendary piloting and survival skills. A phone on the desk began ringing, the old-style ringer bell seeming abrasive and out of place. Nolan didn't move, gazing sightlessly at his own image on the glowing screen. The day had shattered into something surreal, and he was lost for answers. Chapter 5. Present. 5 days after the crash of Ranger 4. Nolan awoke with a start, his eyes flying open. A disturbing and unexpected rustle cut through the pre-dawn stillness. He lay on his back in the mossy clearing near the gaping sinkhole, remnants of unsettled dreams dissipating as he struggled to shake off the last clinging tendrils of sleep. The dense jungle surrounding the encampment was just beginning to stir with the first hesitant calls of waking birds and insects. Nolan held his breath, every sense straining as he listened. There it was again, a faint scuffle followed by the unmistakable sound of fabric shifting. The noise had come from the direction of the edge of the jungle. The hair on the back of his neck prickled as adrenaline flooded his veins. At first he saw nothing amiss in the gloom. Eva and Grace slept nearby. Nolan took care not to make a sound, shifting to a half-crouch. His heart hammered against his ribs. In the dim gray light, he could just make out a shadowy figure hunched over his belongings, rifling through them with quiet but determined intensity. Anger and alarm collided in Nolan's chest as he realized this was the strange watcher who had been tracking them for the last couple of days. After multiple encounters of only catching fleeting glimpses and strange unexplained events, now the elusive figure was brazenly going through Nolan's scarce possessions in clear view. Nolan shifted his weight, moving with excruciating slowness so as not to alert the stranger to his wakefulness. As he eased up onto his elbows, the watcher stiffened. The sound of its pawing hands stopped. Nolan froze, squinting through the gloomy half-light, willing his eyes to make out more details of this enigmatic pursuer. The watcher was tall, well over 6 feet, and covered head to toe in a thick pelt of matted gray fur. The shaggy coat did little to conceal a lean, wiry musculature and long limbs that moved with an unnerving grace. As it lifted its head and peered around the camp, it revealed a face that, while undeniably primate, bore an eerie symmetry to human features, with intelligent, deeply set eyes, a distinctive brow ridge, and a nose that was more protruding than an ape's. The creature's features kept an eerie, distorted echo of a human cast beneath its rough fur. Chills skittered down Nolan's spine, even as his curiosity stirred. What kind of creature was this? Some unknown product of convergent evolution in this isolated environment. Nolan shifted again, more decisively this time, and the Watcher whipped its head around to fix him with an intense, unnerving stare. Its eyes locked onto Nolan's with an uncanny glint of awareness, just as its questing hand closed almost delicately around something in Nolan's pack. For a quivering moment, they remained frozen, human, and inhuman gaze fused in a crackling impasse. Somewhere overhead, the cries of flocking birds split the silence, breaking the spell. The Watcher exploded into motion with shocking speed and agility. With a flutter of sinewy limbs, it sprang away, bounding towards the undergrowth in smooth, loping strides. Nolan saw it had his harmonica clutched fast in one leathery hand. "Hey!" Nolan yelled, his own surprise clear in his voice. Cursing under his breath, sleep-numbed legs tangling in his thin thermal blanket. Kicking free of the entangling fabric, he scrambled after the retreating figure, its shaggy form already disappearing into the lush foliage. Nolan jammed his feet into his unlaced boots and sprinted after it. He lunged. Faint exclamations of confusion sounded from where the others slept behind him. His abrupt shout and scramble awoke them. From far below, Doyle's agitated shouts drifted up out of the sinkhole, demanding to know what was happening. Nolan ignored him, his breath sawing harshly in his lungs as he drove himself harder. Nolan hit the tree line at a dead run, crashing through the undergrowth. Vines and low branches lashed against him, slippery with condensed moisture. He pushed past them, intent only on keeping the Watcher's fading silhouette in view as it loped gracefully through the obstacles that hindered Nolan's own headlong rush. The Watcher moved with astonishing grace through the dense jungle. Nolan stumbled over slippery roots and low-hanging vines, refusing to slow down. Thorny brush clawed at his arms and legs, but he pressed on relentlessly. Nolan crashed headlong through the grasping vines and low-sweeping branches, eyes locked on the retreating form of the Watcher. It was startlingly fast, leaping from fallen tree to high branch with acrobatic flair, somehow graceful despite its loping gait. Nolan slipped on the muddy forest floor, colliding with a tree trunk as he fought to keep up. He scrambled onward, lungs burning. Some primal instinct kept him chasing long after reason said to turn back. He clung to that resolve as the creature drew ahead, weaving effortlessly through terrain that left him gasping and soaked in sweat. They broke into a small open space, the leaf-strewn ground clear of all but a few low bushes. Nolan staggered, almost falling, as his boot caught on an exposed root. Ahead of him, the Watcher had slowed to an easy jog. It turned, casting an inscrutable look back at Nolan, where he pursued several dozen feet behind. Nolan staggered to a gasping halt, hands braced on his thighs, as he struggled to catch his breath. For a fleeting instant their eyes met again across the clearing, Nolan's desperate and questioning, the stranger's bright with some unreadable mix of emotions. Then it was bounding away again, angling effortlessly up the deeply grooved trunk of a towering tree and vanishing into the upper canopy. What in the world had just happened? What was that creature? And why had it taken such focused interest in his things, especially his battered harmonica? His mind spun even as his heaving lungs recovered. Nolan straightened, taking stock of his surroundings. He found himself on the edge of another cavern. Its opening was smaller than the deep sinkhole that still trapped Doyle, but still yawning open to the brightening sky. But instead of a sheer drop, the limestone rocks formed a gradual slope into shadowy depths. His military training reasserted itself as he studied the opening. The sinkhole was massive, easily 30 feet in diameter, sloping into subterranean blackness. Cool, mineral-scented air wafted up to ruffle his sweat-dampened hair as he squinted into the gaping void. He could just make out a deeper, vast space opening up about 100 feet down, where the descending tunnel opened into a kind of subterranean cavern that disappeared into inky blackness. Nolan straightened, skin prickling between his shoulder blades. He eyed the gaping maw with curiosity. If these caverns wormed throughout the cylindrical landscape, accessing them could provide an alternate way to reach Doyle. As he traced the rugged opening with his eyes, movement drew his gaze upward. There, peering down from a high bough, was the Watcher. It lingered this time, observing him with eyes that gleamed too bright, set in that strangely human face. As it turned away, Nolan spotted a glint of metal, his battered harmonica, gripped in one long-fingered hand. With a final piercing look, the Watcher slipped into the emerald maze overhead and was gone. Nolan stared after it for a long moment, his mind spinning over questions he had no way to answer. Crunching footsteps approached from his right, and he turned. Ava emerged from the bushes, a travel pack slung over one shoulder and a handheld radio gripped in her free hand. Strands of dark hair had pulled free of her severe bun to curl around her face. "Nolan!" she exclaimed, relief mixing with annoyance in her voice. "What were you thinking, running off alone like that, not telling anyone, no radio? We need to stick together out here." Nolan met her reproachful look. "I wasn't about to let our Watcher get away without trying to get some answers. The thing was pawing through my personal stuff. It took my harmonica." Eva blew out an irritated sigh, scanning the surrounding trees as if seeking their hidden observer. "Grace fell asleep on her watch," she said. "But she's awake now and I've got her on the radio. We should get back." Nolan looked past her to the fathomless sinkhole. "Just give me a half hour here first." He met her skeptical gaze. "Where does it lead?" she asked, curiosity kindling behind the irritation in her dark eyes. "I don't know. Want to find out?" Nolan crossed to the opening, peering into its depths. For a heartbeat, Eva glowered, hands on hips. Then her expression became one of resignation rather than reproach. With a terse nod, she waved her hand. "Yeah, okay, but you're not going alone." Eva pinched the bridge of her nose between thumb and forefinger. She looked at him, features softening behind her no-nonsense exterior. "And you've got to promise me we'll be careful, okay?" He gave her a lopsided grin. "Careful is my middle name." "It sure as heck isn't your first one," she retorted, but a hint of a smile ghosted the corners of her mouth. Then, with a wary glance towards where the unseen Watcher was lurking somewhere above, he picked his way down the gentle rocky slope into the cavern beyond. Chapter 6. Nolan moved slowly as he descended the rocky slope into the opening of the gaping cave, Eva several paces behind him carrying the walkie-talkie. She radioed back to Grace, letting them know they would be delayed while they looked into something. Nolan picked his way over the rocky verge, loose gravel shifting under his feet. The opening was big enough to drive a truck through. The temperature shifted, becoming cooler as he moved deeper. As the entryway curved slightly, the cave became darker, but ahead there was still dim light, suggesting that there was another source of light somewhere beyond. He wished he had a flashlight, but with nothing, he proceeded. Nolan stepped cautiously off the scree slope onto smooth, faintly concave flooring. He blinked against the deeper darkness, willing his vision to adjust. As faint details emerged, he realized with dawning awe that he stood in the center of an enormous chamber. The curved enclosing walls swept up and away, melding with the soaring vault of the ceiling high overhead. Intricate paintings and carvings crowded every visible surface, their once vibrant pigments faded and mostly hidden in the shadows. Stylized motifs of stars, planetary orbits, and what seemed to be willful abstractions of circuit diagrams marched in repetitive motifs over the stone walls. Nolan turned in a slow circle, neck craning to take it all in. High above, a hole in the cave's top opened to the jungle, allowing in a small amount of dim light that did little to illuminate the expansive space. A chill ran down his spine as the sheer size of the chamber sunk in. Eva moved up beside him, equally stunned. Her gaze traveled across the walls before settling on a long metal conduit running along the base. She pointed, glancing at Nolan. "What do you think that is?" "Could be anything. Electrical, coolant lines, life support system. Who knows how long it's been down here?" He peered at the conduit, reluctantly turning his attention from the mesmerizing paintings. About an inch in diameter, the pipe followed the curve of the wall, disappearing into darkness on either end. "It's definitely man-made," he said. "Or whatever made this place. But not natural." Ava nodded slowly, still scanning their surroundings. Part of the ancient civilization. Nolan made a small sound of agreement, fingers trailing over the weathered metal. Together they began following the pipe, curiosity overcoming unease. There was no sunlight this deep in the cave, but as Nolan's eyes further adjusted, he discerned more conduits branching off, trailing up and across the walls. What looked like junction boxes dotted the rock face at intervals. The entire setup resembled an electrical system. But for what purpose? They had only walked 50 yards or so when Eva grabbed his shoulder, pointing wordlessly. One branch of the conduit system led to a rectangular metal box mounted on the wall. He stepped closer, inspecting it. "What do you think it is?" she asked Nolan again. He brushed a hand over the box. Age had corroded the surface, but it seemed intact. About 3 feet high and 2 across, it had visible hinges on one side and a latch mechanism on the other. He grabbed the latch and pulled, but nothing moved. He braced himself, pulling harder until he felt something deep inside yield slightly. He repositioned his grip and pulled again, harder, muscles cording in his forearms. With a screech of reluctant metal, it suddenly popped open, and the cover swung smoothly on its ancient hinges. Enthralled, they peered inside. Beyond lay what resembled an analog breaker box. An enormous knife switch dominated the center, its thick insulated handle tipped down into the off position. The surrounding panel housed rows of rusted stud connectors, some still housing intact cables. Affixed to the back of the door, some kind of technical drawing was peeling and faded with time. Nolan shook his head. What does it do?" Eva wondered aloud. "One way to find out." Nolan reached cautiously for the switch. "Let's hope it doesn't blow us up, yeah?" He grasped the handle firmly and heaved it upwards, squeezing his eyes shut. It locked into place with a resonant clunk. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. No explosion or shriek of stressed metal. But somewhere in the distance came a resonant clunk, like the closing of a massive circuit, followed by a rising mechanical hum. Behind his eyelids, Nolan sensed an increasing glow and squinted against the light as he opened his eyes. He glanced at Ava, and they shared an amazed smile. Incandescent bulbs ignited along the length of every conduit, branching spider-like across the walls. The warm light revealed the true scale of the cavern, and Nolan drew in his breath slowly. It was spectacular. "Would you look at that?" he murmured. The vast space easily dwarfed Grand Central Station. Intricate mosaics of tessellated figures covered every surface, seemingly chronicling a rich history in their faded pigments. A forest of stalagmites and slender columns rose to meet curtains of mineral-crusted stalactites dripping from above. The play of light and shadow brought the scene to vivid life, and Nolan's eye drank in tiny details. Here, the curve of a reclining figure. There, an abstract pattern that teased his perception. It was simultaneously primeval and futuristic. As Nolan studied a grouping of figures clustered under a crude rendition of a rocket ship, depictions of celestial spheres and intricately woven designs covered every inch. Nolan even noticed a pair of cylindrical drawings that he believed to be the shape of this habitat. The Bentham anomaly. "My God," Nolan breathed. "It's incredible," Eva finished faintly. They moved deeper into the chamber, necks craning. Here and there, portions of the ceiling or walls were collapsed or broken away, leaving debris mounded on the otherwise smooth floor. Glittering mineral deposits lined some crevices, looking almost like circuitry veins. Nolan's sharp gaze tracked across the endless mural, looking for some meaning in the sly geometric designs that spoke of advanced intelligence. Yet so much didn't make sense. Why here, buried and forgotten? Why the odd integration of machinery and Stone Age art? A reflection caught Nolan's eye, and he turned towards the rear of the cave. There, an underground pond lay undisturbed, tinged azure from the glow of submerged lighting. As he watched, Tendrils of mist curled across the surface as humid cave air chilled against the water. The effect was simultaneously beautiful and ominous. Nolan glanced back at the breaker box in sudden understanding. Whoever built this place had integrated power systems into its very structure. But for what purpose? Next to the pool, the dim cave light illuminated a form that piqued Nolan's curiosity. A vehicle, evidently forsaken and in disrepair. As he squinted through the dim light, the form became clearer, revealing what he thought looked like a NASA all-terrain rover, its once sleek frame now marred by signs of decay and neglect. As he began making his way over to examine it, a sharp exclamation jerked him from his thoughts. Eva stood 50 feet away, gesturing emphatically near a side passage, yawning darkly to their left. "Nolan, over here." He picked his way carefully over the uneven ground. As he drew near, the sight before them left him momentarily speechless. A slab of matte black metal filled the side passage from floor to ceiling, featureless except for a vertical seam down the center. Nolan reached out to brush his fingers over the surface, feeling unnatural smoothness under the dust. "What is this?" Eva traced her hand down one of dozens of gashes marring its surface. They looked as if someone had tried unsuccessfully to pry it open by force. Nolan shook his head. A door, gate, airlock. Its purpose evaded him. His gaze traveled down the many scratches and gouges noticeably centered around the seam, some newer than others. What had the previous inhabitants been so desperate to get into or get away from? Nolan noticed a subtle shift in the light coming from above. He spun to see the silhouetted figure of the Watcher, standing at the edge of the natural skylight into the jungle, high above. It was watching them. Eva's radio crackled sharply, making them both jump. Then a voice, broken by static, echoed oddly off the cavern walls. "Hear me? What's your—" Cursing, Nolan stared down at the radio on Eva's belt. "The rock walls must be interfering," he muttered. "Let's get closer to the entrance." They swiftly crossed back towards the pond, the radio reception clearing in fits and bursts as they walked. The dark figure by the tunnel opening had vanished. Finally, about 30 feet from the water's edge, Grace's voice resolved into clarity. "Hear me. Come in." Eva toggled the transmit button. "Grace, we read you. This is Eva. What's going on?" There was a weighty pause before a male voice answered instead. "Well, Doc, we got good news and bad news." Doyle's wry drawl held a note of tension beneath the nonchalance. "Good news first. Somebody turned the blazing lights on down here." Nolan and Eva exchanged glances. She pressed the transmit button again. "Wait, you have lights where you are now, too?" "Yup. Whole place is lit up like a Christmas tree. Hell of a lot more than trees down here, though. You wouldn't believe." On the other side of the radio, Grace's strident tone cut him off. "Never mind that for now. Tell them the bad news, Doyle." There was a faint scuffling sound, followed by Doyle's sigh. "Yeah, okay. So the bad news is that Grace decided to try that rope ladder without waiting for you two." Even from a distance, they could envision his sardonic eyebrow raise. "Probably didn't help that I kept demanding that someone get me the heck out of here. Anyway, her bum leg gave out halfway down. Now we both get to float around this damn pool and wait for rescue." Nolan scrubbed a hand down his face, trying to tamp down his anger. "Is Grace okay?" "Oh yeah, just bruised pride," Doyle replied. "She's paddling around cussing up a storm at yours truly. I told her that those kinds of manners are going to get her evicted from the emergency raft." Nolan blinked. "Okay. And tell me about the lights." "Yes, sir. Whole place just lit up all at once. They're strung up all along the outside, even down below the water." Doyle's voice held a note of wonder beneath the nonchalance. "Now I can see clear as day, even down to some caverns beneath us in the pond." Nolan's gaze jerked back towards the mechanical door sealing off the side tunnel. An icy finger of suspicion traced his spine. What if— Doyle was still talking, the story coming out bit by bit. Anyway, so Her Highness gets fed up waiting and decides to try the rope ladder solo. Wouldn't wait to test it, had to be first down the hole. She tosses it over the side. I tell her to hang on. Did she listen? No. Starts climbing down just as the whole rig comes loose. In Nolan's mind, he could see it unfold. Grace swaying precariously on the ropes, too stubborn to call for help. Then the sudden gut-twisting plunge into dark water as the ladder falls away. Doyle huffed a humorless laugh. Heck of a splash she made, too. Thought the walls would come down. Now her and the busted ladder are keeping me company until you show up. Nolan stared down at the radio, emotions twisting between frustration and worry. How deep is that water, Doyle? Oh, still can't see the bottom. His casual tone didn't quite mask the unease. But hey, bright side. We got lights now. Ain't that something? Nolan sighed and exchanged a look with Eva. Sit tight, Nolan radioed. There's still one more thing I need to check out over here. Then we'll head back your way. Chapter 7. 1981, about 18 months before the launch of the ARGO mission. In the warm, dim lighting within the Driftwood Shack, a local restaurant built on the edge of the Osceola River, in his hometown of Palm Dunes, Florida, Nolan was seated at the well-worn upright piano tucked in the corner, playing the final song of a blues set alongside 3 other local musicians. The piano had a certain charm that came with its old age and frequent use, familiar under his fingertips. The warm ambient light cast a soft glow on the ivory keys as Nolan lost himself in the music, his posture moving with each rise and fall, confident and soulful. His left hand laid down a steady walking bass line, the heartbeat of the song. His right hand danced across the keys, jittering intricate melodies and accents, expressive and emotive, improvisational and deeply personal. The band's smoky-voiced singer echoed the haunting lyrics of the Beatles' song, Across the Universe. As the song crescendoed towards its finale, Nolan played a dynamic run, flourishing to a powerful finish that drew out the energy for the patrons crowded at the bar. Head tilted back, eyes closed, he hardly noticed their applause. Rising, he closed the piano's fallboard and used his sleeve to wipe sweat from his brow. Nolan stepped off stage, grabbing his harmonica, and slid it into a worn metal tin. Carrying it, he moved toward the deck outside when a tap on his shoulder gave him pause, a polite request for his autograph. Nolan turned, expecting the usual question about his selection for the ARGO mission. Instead, he was surprised and delighted to see his old friend and mentor, Kelvin Gallagher. Nolan broke into a smile, embracing him. "I can't believe you're actually here," Nolan exclaimed, gripping Kelvin's shoulders. His mentor, one of the few people who truly understood him, who had seen him at his lowest and helped him rebuild. "You didn't think I'd miss your debut as a bona fide national celebrity, did you?" Kelvin replied. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he studied Nolan with an expression of mingling pride and weariness. Nolan chuckled, the sound almost foreign after the last week of tension and uncertainty since the announcement. How easily Kelvin could disarm his worries, even if just for a moment. "Come on, I'll get you a drink. We've got a lot of catching up to do." Nolan slung an arm around Kelvin's broad shoulders and led him out to the deck overlooking the river. Out there, the night scene was peaceful, the Osceola River's gentle currents reflecting flickers of starlight. Nolan set his harmonica tin on the table as a bartender brought his usual IPA. "That was some set tonight," he remarked, casting an appraising look at Nolan. "And you must be on top of the world after getting picked as a finalist for that space mission." Nolan shrugged, the familiar weight of attention settling back upon him. He took a long draw of his beer, leaning forward. "Honestly, Kelvin, it's been non-stop. Overwhelming." Kelvin nodded. "I figured. That's why I came. Give you a chance to talk without the glare of the spotlight for a night." Nolan smiled. Around them, the gentle hubbub of the restaurant continued, patrons laughing, the clink of cutlery on plates barely audible over the blues singer wrapping up another song inside. The familiar ambience eased his tension. "Want to let me in on how you ended up in this situation?" Kelvin prodded. Last I checked, you were happy sticking to local gigs and your banner flying jobs. Nolan let out a harsh bark that might have been a laugh. He took another swig of beer before meeting his friend's shrewd gaze. That makes two of us, because I sure didn't sign up for any civilian astronaut competition. Kelvin's eyebrow quirked. But someone did, I presume. You got that right. Nolan leaned back, rolling the cold bottle between his palms. Question is who, and why? No guesses? Kelvin asked. No one close enough to know your unique qualifications. Nolan paused with his drink halfway to his lips. Realization dawned in his eyes as he considered the knowing look on Kelvin's face. Annie, he muttered. Memories of his ex-fiancée came flooding back in a bittersweet cascade. The woman who had loved him, believed in him, but whom he'd ultimately pushed away. Bingo, said Kelvin. Gotta say, it sounds just like one of her harebrained schemes to get you out of your comfort zone. Nolan grimaced, even as a part of him thrilled at this evidence she still cared. Yeah. Well, this goes way beyond my comfort zone, Kelvin. This is a one-way trip to deep space to study some anomalous objects. He rubbed the stubble along his jawline. Over the water, he spotted a night heron gliding in the darkness. He envied its tranquil solitude, so different from the chaos Annie had thrown him into. It does sound like something she'd do, he muttered. She was always trying to get me to live up to my potential, reach higher. His voice trailed off. Kelvin studied him with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to bore straight through to his soul. But those ambitions of hers are exactly why you ended it, weren't they? Nolan stiffened. An old wound, torn open. His gaze dropped to his scarred knuckles, relics from years of physical labor. Ambition almost got me killed once already, if you recall, he said. Forgive me if I don't jump at round two. The jungle flashed through his mind, wet, cloying, the bitterness of desperation choking his throat. He shoved the memories away. Silence hung between them, filled only by the gentle lapping of water against the deck. When Nolan finally spoke, his voice was cold steel. In any case, doesn't matter why she did it, I never should have been selected as a finalist. As soon as I get the chance, I'm dropping out. Kelvin showed no surprise, merely swirled the ice cubes in his glass. If that's truly what you want, Nolan, so be it, he said. But are you sure you aren't letting fear make this decision for you? Nolan bristled. What if I am? He leaned forward, jabbing an accusing finger at the tabletop to emphasize his words. I never wanted another adventure, Kelvin. I just want a nice, simple, quiet life for once. Is that so wrong? Kelvin held his gaze. Of course not. But since when have you been one to walk away from a challenge? He gestured at their surroundings. The bar where Nolan played. The skies he piloted. The town he called home. The Nolan I know never backed down because something intimidated him. Blood rushed to Nolan's face. Damn it, you're not listening. This isn't about cowardice, it's... He faltered. Across the table, Kelvin watched him patiently. When Nolan continued, the fight had drained from his voice. It's just, in the back of my mind, I always thought that Annie and I could... He shook his head, laughing bitterly. Ah. Understanding dawned in Kelvin's eyes. So, you'd give it all up for a failed relationship? Nolan shook his head, then drained his beer, seeking liquid courage. If I do this, Kelvin, chances are I don't come back. Annie knows that too. Even the talking heads on the news are saying how many things could go wrong. His shoulders slumped. Once again, the heron crossed his vision, solitary and free. And if by some miracle I do come back, it'll be years from now, and Annie will have moved on. His fingers traced the edges of his harmonica case. Across from him, Kelvin listened, brow creased with empathy. When Nolan finished, throat tight with emotion, his mentor reached out and gripped his shoulder. Nolan. Kelvin's voice was gravelly with encouragement. Even if all that's true, Doesn't that make seizing this chance now even more vital? How will you forgive yourself if you walk away, then spend every night staring up at the stars, wondering if you should have gone? Kelvin reached for the worn metal tin sitting between them, picking it up. With care, Kelvin opened it, the creak of metal hinges loud in the stillness that had fallen over their conversation. Nestled inside, dulled by time yet still cherished, lay the harmonica Nolan had clung to during his days stranded in enemy territory in Vietnam. Kelvin reverently traced the inscription etched into the lid. "Don't lose the tune." "You know what comes to my mind when I read this?" Kelvin asked. Nolan just shook his head, staring at the instrument that had been his lifeline, his beacon of hope when surrounded by despair. "I'm thinking about the man who taught me what these words really mean," Kelvin continued. "The one who proved to me that losing hope is not an option, no matter how dire things become." He lifted his head and met Nolan's gaze. "This is just like Vietnam all over again. You have a choice, to back down because the way forward seems impossibly daunting, or to press on because giving up is infinitely worse." Nolan let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, even as memories flooded his senses. The acrid scent of smoke and rotting vegetation, the bone-deep chill of muddy water soaking his ragged uniform, the echo of bombs detonating somewhere far away. And through it all, this harmonica, the sole bridge back to his humanity. "That was different, and you know it," he said, the words sharp with remembered anguish. "I didn't have a choice back then. It was survive or die. This mission, though, this is me choosing to walk away from everything and everyone I care about. And for what?" His voice dropped to a pained whisper. "A one-way ticket to oblivion." Beyond the railing of the deck, the heron still glided in solitary majesty over the glassy water, and above the stars burned with cold, indifferent fire. With an abrupt scrape, Nolan shoved his chair back and strode to the railing. Kelvin could hear his labored breathing as he gripped the pitted wood. The tension radiating off him was palpable. In a low, rough voice, Nolan finally spoke. "That jungle, it darn near broke me. You know that." He turned back, eyes haunted but determined. "And when I came back, you convinced me to keep fighting when giving up would have been so easy." His knuckles stood out white from clenching the railing. "I thought I'd already given enough, haven't I?" The question echoed over the water and disappeared into the gentle night. Kelvin rose and moved to stand by Nolan's side, gazing out over the rippling black glass toward the slender heron. "I can't make this choice for you, but I can remind you that walking away out of fear plants seeds of regret that could taint all the days to come." Nolan turned to face him. Kelvin's eyes reflected the moonlight. "I understand the temptation to turn back from all this," Kelvin said, "but like before, backing away is not the solution. The solution is to go deeper." Chapter 8. Present. 5 days after the crash of Ranger 4. Nolan and Eva walked around the Rover, performing a visual inspection before doing anything else. The vehicle's battered exterior told a tale of tragedy and abandonment. "I don't know what happened here, but this Rover has quite a story to tell," Nolan said. The Rover's metallic body bore the scars of calamity. Rust bled from every crevice as if it were a dying creature. The thick tires, once ready for off-road adventure, now clung limp and deflated to their rims. A layer of sediment blanketed the Rover like a shroud, as if the cavern itself were reclaiming it. As Nolan's eyes traveled over the ruined hulk, details leaped out, reinforcing the impression of a violent end met too soon. He imagined what the Rover had originally looked like, equipped for survival, only to end up broken and abandoned in this underground cave. What had it witnessed before being left here to waste away? The mechanical arm now hung limply, its attachments scattered on the ground nearby. "If we can get this thing back to the sinkhole, we might be able to use the arm and winch to lower a harness for Doyle and Grace," Nolan commented. Eva just nodded, her grave face mirroring Nolan's mood. The chassis bore deep scrapes and dents, evidence of either a catastrophic collision or an explosion. The remaining solar array was mangled almost beyond recognition. Nolan shook his head at the waste and loss of such advanced technology. Even if they could restore power, the drive mechanics were likely damaged beyond any field repair they could manage. Nolan kneeled beside the rover's flank, using his palm to wipe away some of the grime obscuring the mission insignia. He revealed just enough to confirm what he already knew in his gut. The faded Frontier 1 logo stared back like a headstone, paired with the Project ARGO emblem. It's from the first ship, all right. Consistent with the escape pod we found a couple of days ago, he muttered. As Nolan surveyed the buckled cabin frame, he spotted the rover's door hanging ajar. Through veined cracks in the armored windshield, he glimpsed the interior. The seats were cloaked in particulate, undisturbed, since the crew had scrambled out for the last time. The screens and instruments were dead, their muted interfaces recording nothing but the fingerprints of ghosts. Reaching through the open door, Nolan toggled the master switch, more from gathering information than any genuine hope. As expected, nothing happened. "Power cells are toast," he said. "No clue how we'll haul this back for the rescue without juice." Eva started to reply when a glint at the back of the rover caught her eye. She put a hand on Nolan's shoulder, wordlessly directing his gaze. Together, they crossed to the rover's rear storage bay. Eva popped the latch and raised the access panel, revealing the cargo hold within. Most of the hold was empty, but two sleek storage cases seemed out of place amidst the rover's scarred utilitarian interior. Nolan's pulse quickened at the discovery. Strange symbols marked the container. One case was still sealed, but the other had been opened hastily and not properly relatched. Nolan grabbed its edge and slid it from the bay, laying it on the ground as Eva circled around to look inside. The interior held customized foam recesses for multiple tier-shaped units. Two spaces were vacant, but the other still cradled its cargo, a shiny cylindrical device slightly smaller than a football. As Nolan lifted it out, turning it over, the external housing gave no hint of function or origin. Then he spotted the mouthpiece on its side and an activation switch on the end. Strange symbols marked the silver surface, etched into the material. Some kind of breathing rigs? Nolan thought aloud. Rebreathers, maybe. Let you stay underwater a while without tank and gear? His mind raced, synapses firing as observations slid into place. Whoever had abandoned the rover had taken 2 rebreathers and never returned. He couldn't say for sure that they had gone down into the cave pool, but it was the most likely series of events. "If there are underwater caves down there," Nolan said, "and if these can let us breathe underwater, then I think we may just have a better way to get Doyle and Grace out of there." Eva, too, fit the pieces together, her expression morphing from curiosity to dawning insight. But a shadow crossed her face at the implications. "Even with rebreathers, who knows where the pool leads," she countered. "It could be a maze of caves down there." Nolan considered this, Eva's skepticism giving him pause. As he gazed into the glowing waters of the subterranean pool, an idea began percolating. "Hold up, I've got it," he said, snapping his fingers. "The breaker. It controls all the cave lighting. We use it to map our route." Before she could object, Nolan was bounding back to the metal breaker box near their cavern entrance. He unlatched the door, revealing the analog guts within. Rows of switches, dials, and wiring bundles that looked ancient, but spoke of durable functionality. Attached to the inside of the door itself was a technical diagram etched onto metal. A circuit routing map. Nolan's finger traced the elaborate pathways, etched symbols marking underground landmarks. "Here," Nolan tapped the map. "This section matches where Doyle and Grace are trapped." His finger danced along a snaking line, tracing it across junctions and around indecipherable symbols. "And this path leads straight back to us here," he concluded, stabbing at a symbol matching the very cavern in which they stood. Nolan turned to Eva, eyes alight with revelation. "We use the master breaker to kill power to all other routes," he explained, leaving just the lights along our intended course activated to guide us. Eva chewed her lip, scanning the inscrutable diagram with furrowed brows. It's still a gamble without fully understanding this tech, she maintained. But peering closer at the breaker box innards, she nodded. But I'll admit, the builders clearly understood these caves better than we do, she conceded. All right, let's give it a shot. Nolan grinned, reaching for the first switch extending from the breaker panel, but his hand froze halfway when a ghostly strain of music came wafting through the dark gallery behind them. Low, wheezing notes hung in the air before fading into silence. They wheeled in unison toward the sound. Nolan narrowed his eyes, pulse elevating. Was that my harmonica? He muttered. Do you think that creature actually knows how to play it? Eva whispered. The song. It sounds familiar. Is that... Nolan finished her thought. Yeah, it's Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. They peered into the dark reaches of the natural cave, but the song didn't resume. Nolan shook off the surreal encounter, turning back to the task at hand. He took a firm grip on the breaker handle protruding from the box. Let him watch all he wants, Nolan stated. We've got people to save. You radio Doyle and Grace, and I'll adjust the circuits. With a firm heave, he threw down multiple levers in a single decisive motion. Mechanical relays chunked like rifle bolts within the breaker box guts. Around them, almost all the cave lights powered down, leaving but a single illuminated tunnel leading off into the shadows. It was all riding on Nolan's map theory now. Lives hung in the balance. Eva lifted the handheld radio and keyed the mic. We think we have a plan to get you out of there. We're on our way back to you, she said. With rebreathers and gear in hand, they began their trek out of the mouth of the cave and back into the habitat jungle. Chapter 9. 1981, about 18 months before the launch of the ARGO mission. Nolan pushed through the front door of the Palm Dunes cycling shop a few minutes before 6 in the evening. As he took in the details of the cozy space, the handwritten signs advertising used bikes for sale, the racks of helmets and cycling shoes, the faded tourism posters on the walls, he called out to the woman working behind the counter. I'm looking for some of those inappropriately tight bike shorts, he said, his voice serious. The petite redhead sorting through a box of handlebar tape glanced up, an uncertain look on her face. Oh, I'm so sorry, but we're actually just closing up for the... Recognition flashed in her blue eyes. Very funny, Nolan, she said, shaking her head. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Annie Peck, Nolan's ex-fiancée, came around the counter, arms crossed, taking him in with an appraising look. Nolan held up the takeout bag dangling from his fingers. Brought you something, your favorite, from Siam Sunset. Annie eyed the bag, and Nolan saw her nostrils flare as she caught a whiff of the rich curry inside. Did you get the yellow curry combo? She asked, a note of longing in her voice. With extra pineapple fried rice, just how you like it. Annie bit her lip. Ugh, that sounds so good. But I'm training, Nolan. The triathlon is less than 2 months away. I have to stick to my meal plan. Nolan raised an eyebrow. Never stopped you before. Not when it comes to their massaman curry. Annie wavered, shifting her weight from one leg to the other. Well, maybe I could have just a bite, or two. A mischievous grin split across her face, making her look years younger. But that's it. They busied themselves, closing up the small shop, falling into an easy rhythm born from familiarity. As Nolan helped stack helmets and hang up jerseys, his mind wandered back through the years to when this after-hours ritual was a regular part of their relationship. A familiar tightness gripped his chest. So what's all this about, Nolan? Annie asked, breaking the silence. You just show up with my favorite takeout after, what has it been, 9 months? 10, Nolan said. Their eyes met, and in Annie's gaze, Nolan saw a mirror of his own conflicted emotions, the resonance of shared history entangled with heartbreak. Annie looked away first. I wanted to talk to you about something, Nolan said. It's big news. Annie studied him for a long moment before turning to shut off the lights and arm the security system. She pulled the door closed behind them, metal grating rattling as she locked it. "Well, don't keep me in suspense," she said. Side by side, they headed down the sidewalk, lined with palms and flower boxes overflowing with red and orange blossoms. The aroma from the takeout bag grew more tantalizing with each step. At the end of the block, they settled onto a picnic table nestled in a gazebo overlooking the memorial gardens. Nolan opened the various containers of Thai food, releasing curls of aromatic steam into the evening air. "This is way too much food for the two of us," Annie protested, even as she snagged a piece of golden curry chicken and popped it in her mouth. Her eyes closed in bliss. Nolan chuckled. "I figured we could just pack up the leftovers for your next day off." Annie shot him a mock glare and snatched another piece of chicken. "So go on. What's this news?" Nolan hesitated. Now that the moment had arrived, uncertainty flooded him. He busied himself dishing out rice onto paper plates. "You know what it is I want to talk about, don't you?" he finally said. "If I did, would I be asking?" Annie stirred her curry. Steam wisped up from the surface. Nolan took a deep breath. "I got selected as one of the 5 finalists for the only civilian spot on the ARGO mission." Annie's spoon stilled. She looked at him, brows furrowing. "That sounds like great news, Nolan." Nolan gave a short, brittle laugh. "That's what people keep telling me. But the thing is, I never submitted an application. Someone else submitted one in my name, filled everything out. Knew things about me that only—" He lifted his eyes to hers, questioningly. Annie sighed, putting down her spoon. "I should have known you'd ruin a perfectly lovely dinner by confronting me," she grumbled. But there was a hint of amusement behind it. Nolan fought to keep his voice even against the turmoil her admission triggered. "I want to know why. We ended things, Annie. We both agreed." He faltered, old grief welling. Taking a deep breath, he continued, "You chose your triathlons over me, and now, out of nowhere, you just decide to sign me up for something life-changing without even asking me? Help me understand." Annie bristled, her shoulders tensing. "Oh, come on. Do I really need to spell it out for you? No one is more perfect for this mission than you are, Nolan. No one." Her voice rang with conviction. She jabbed her spoon at him for emphasis. "Me? Perfect?" Nolan gave a bitter laugh. "I'm a washed-up pilot leading a quiet life, remember? The most excitement I want is catching a big trout on my day off. Don't give me that. You're a decorated veteran and legendary survivor, with thousands of flight hours under your belt. And I never wanted to go to space," Nolan interjected, his measured tone fraying at the edges. "I was done with high-stakes situations after the war, done with adventure. All I want is a peaceful, simple routine. Why can't you understand that?" He shoved a too large bite of curry into his mouth, the flavors turning to ash on his tongue. Annie watched him across the picnic table, her fingers whirring over a napkin. Beyond the gazebo, the sun dipped low over the ocean. Palm fronds rustled in the evening breeze. "Nolan," Annie began, then hesitated. She set her jaw, meeting his eyes. "You have an amazing opportunity here. Don't you see that?" Nolan looked away. "I know," he said. "Then what's the problem?" Annie's voice wavered. Nolan turned his gaze out towards the gardens. "I've decided I'm not going to accept the spot." Annie gave a sad half-smile. "Have you already given them your answer?" He sighed. "I have 6 more days to accept or decline their offer. Already pushed it by asking for an extension." He scrubbed both hands through his hair until it stood in tousled peaks. They sat in silence as fluorescent lights flickered on along the seaside shops and restaurants, golden light spilling out onto the brick promenade. The aroma of frying oil mingled with the scent of Annie's cooling curry. Finally, Nolan stood, dropping his napkin onto his half-eaten food. "Thanks for dinner. I should get going. Let you enjoy the rest." He moved to leave, but Annie's voice pulled him back. Nolan, wait. There's something else you should know. He lowered himself back down. Annie took a breath, her expression sober. I got an offer too, from a triathlon coach in Hawaii. He wants to take me on, train me for the Ironman Championships. It's the opportunity I've been waiting years for. Nolan stared at her. What are you saying? I already accepted. I leave in 6 weeks. Sold the bike shop last month to help pay for it. She gave a small, helpless shrug. It's my big chance, Nolan. You're moving to Hawaii, Nolan repeated. Annie's news winded him in a way he hadn't expected. She would be leaving no matter what he decided about the ARGO mission. The realization ached. This is a new chapter for me, Annie faltered. She reached across the table, placing her small, calloused hand over his. Her touch jolted through him. It doesn't have to be goodbye for us. And if you go on the ARGO mission, I'll be cheering you on from the islands. Nolan's throat tightened. The moment hung between them, weighted with memories and roads not taken. He gently extracted his hand from beneath hers. I know you said you already decided, Annie said. But promise me you'll keep thinking about it. Be mad at me all you want, but don't waste this opportunity. Nolan shook his head, unable to process it all. When's the absolute latest you can make your final decision? About the mission? Annie asked. 1 week from today. We have to be on site at Cape Canaveral next Monday to start pre-launch training. If I even accept the spot. Saying it aloud somehow made it more daunting. Chapter 10. Present. 5 days after the crash of Ranger 4. Back at the sinkhole, standing at a safe distance from the gaping hole to the underground lake below, Nolan opened one of the cases and took out the rebreather devices. He tossed down a device for both Doyle and Grace. Here, catch, Nolan called out as the rebreathers splashed into the dark water. He heard Doyle grab his device while Grace retrieved hers from where it had drifted near the craggy cave wall. Nolan held a third rebreather, turning to Eva and told her he had decided to go down into the underground lake with the others to guide them through the tunnel network. I don't think that's a good idea, Eva said, her brow furrowing with concern. You said yourself these tunnels are unexplored. It's too dangerous for all of you to go wandering off down there. Nolan shook his head. I've studied the diagrams. I can lead us through the main tunnels. With the lights turned on, it should be fairly straightforward. Eva folded her arms across her chest. And what if you get lost, or those old lights fail? Then I'll be stuck up here alone with no way of even knowing if you're alive or dead. Nolan held her gaze, glimpsing the worry in her eyes. We have the rebreathers. The lights will guide us, he assured. The plan is going to work. Eva bit her bottom lip, conflicted. Nolan could see the worry in her eyes. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Trust me. I can do this. Eva shrugged his hand away, her voice rising. But the diagrams showed unexplored areas, places the lights don't reach. What if you end up there? Without having the maps with you, how can you guide them? There are risks either way, Nolan conceded. But letting Doyle and Grace wander those caves blind could be a death sentence if they lose their way. From below, Doyle called up to them sarcastically. Hey, what's the holdup up there? You two gonna stand there chatting all day, or are we getting out of here? Nolan moved closer to the hole and called down. Just working out the details. To Eva, he said more gently. They need my help to get through the caves. Eva crossed her arms, shaking her head. But Nolan sensed her resolute stance softening. Why don't you both just come down here? Doyle yelled up, his voice reverberating off the rocky walls. No need to leave anyone behind. Nolan raised his eyebrows at Eva, but she shook her head. Not a chance, she muttered. Nolan could hear the self-doubt creeping into her tone. She bit her lip, weighing their limited, risky options. She threw her hands up in exasperation. Great. So either I let you dive off on this crazy underwater mission and stay up here alone not knowing if you'll ever return, or I knowingly join you in the bowels of an unexplored alien cave system, where our only route of escape is... diving through more unexplored alien cave systems. Awesome options. As she paced in frustration, Nolan met her gaze. I had a commanding officer who once told me, when you have a problem staring you down, backing out is not the solution. The only way out is to go deeper. Eva searched his eyes. She let out a slow breath and dropped her arms to her sides. I'm staying topside. I'll keep watch from up here. Nolan gave Eva a confident nod. Then he turned, tossed his rebreather down to Grace, and took several steps back from the craggy sinkhole edge. Come on, slowpoke. I'm turning into a raisin down here waiting on you, Doyle yelled. Nolan tuned out the jest and focused on the jump, gauging the distance to the dark water dozens of feet below. Just yesterday, he had clung desperately to this same rocky edge, fighting for his life against the inexorable gravity that threatened to pull him down into the cave's depths. Now, he consciously prepared to surrender himself to that fatal plunge. The irony was not lost on him. He inhaled, centering his nerves. Then he broke into a sprint right for the brink. 2 bounding strides later, he launched himself out, over the void. The empty abyss yawned before him as he launched himself into the air. For a moment, he flew, suspended over the dark waters as the sunlight faded behind him. The noise and light from above disappeared, replaced by mute blue shadows and the chill darkness below. Then, the icy water stabbed at his skin like 1,000 knives. He gasped involuntarily, then clamped his mouth shut before he could swallow a lungful of water. He regained control of his breathing and oriented himself, marveling at the strange beauty of the surrounding grotto. Jutting rock formations lined the walls, while thick columns rose from the depths to meet a high, vaulted ceiling. Rays of sunlight slanted down through several holes and fractures, dappling the plant growth along the walls with dancing flashes of radiance. Geez Louise, he gasped, peering around with wide eyes. No wonder you were cussing about the cold. No kidding, Mr. Aquaman, Doyle quipped. Told you that yesterday. Nice entrance, by the way. Very graceful. Nolan shot him an exaggerated scowl, then turned his attention to taking in their surroundings. The glow from the underwater lighting cast the craggy cave walls in an ethereal blue-green aura. The intense beams converged at a dark opening in a submerged cave far below the water's surface. Their way out. Far above, Eva's silhouette peered over the edge. Okay, Nolan said, all business again. Let's review the plan so we all understand. I'll lead the way, following the lights. Stay right with me at all times. If anyone starts to fall behind or panics, signal the others immediately. He demonstrated a few simple hand gestures they could use to communicate underwater if necessary. Grace and Doyle paid sharp attention, clearly taking the danger seriously now that they were committed to facing them. Any questions? Nolan asked. Both Doyle and Grace shook their heads, gripping their rebreathers. Good, Nolan confirmed. Once we submerge, remember, no matter what happens, keep moving for the far exit point. It's our only... A sudden scream rang out from above, reverberating through the cave. All 3 of them jerked their heads up to see Eva stumbling back from the opposite side of the rocky hole, raw fear contorting her face. There stood the imposing form of the Watcher, its matted fur silhouetted against the sunlight behind it. The tall creature loomed over Eva, gangly arms gesturing frantically. What the heck? Doyle muttered. Nolan watched, feeling completely helpless in the knowledge he couldn't do anything to reach Eva. But something in the Watcher's frenzied movements gave him pause. They almost seemed desperate, pleading. Before Nolan could discern anything, the Watcher and Eva both snapped their gazes to something beyond the sinkhole rim. Their eyes blew wide in shared horror. Eva's screaming intensified, but she appeared to be frozen in stunned terror. Then Nolan glimpsed an amorphous black shape swooping down over the jungle behind them. It moved too smoothly, too quickly to be an animal. An impenetrable cloud of darkness, somehow both diffuse and yet coherent at once. The Watcher turned and loped away into the trees just as the sinister mass shot forward. Every primal instinct screamed at the sight of the nightmarish apparition. As realization dawned in Eva's eyes, she turned and stumbled back from the encroaching darkness. Before she made it 2 steps, the ink-black cloud erupted forward to engulf her. Her shrieks dissolved into the void a second before the roiling umbra swallowed her completely. Then, as quickly as it came, the seething darkness receded back into the jungle and vanished from sight, leaving no trace of Eva behind. Nolan realized his heart was hammering. He exchanged an awestruck glance with Doyle and Grace. "What? What in heaven's name was that?" Doyle whispered, shaken. Nolan just shook his head, a chill coursing through his whole body that had nothing to do with the icy water. He glanced upwards. No movement. No sound at all except for the occasional drip of moisture echoing through the caves. What the heck had they just witnessed? "We need to get out of here," Grace urged. "Now!" Nolan grappled with his reeling mind, forcing it back under control. Their plan hadn't changed. "She's right. We can't help her from down here," he confirmed, meeting their anxious eyes. "It's time to go." They positioned their rebreathers. As Nolan took one last glance up at the lone patch of jungle visible above them, he silently hoped that Eva was all right, but he feared that the silence did not bode well at all. With a deep inhale, he dove beneath the dark waters. Nolan kicked hard, descending straight for the opening, spilling its warm glow out into the flooded caverns. Doyle and Grace followed close behind. Together, they slipped into the beckoning passageway, leaving behind the last vestiges of daylight. Chapter 11. Nolan swam deeper into the underwater cave, following the ancient, incandescent lights that lined the natural rock tunnel walls, spaced about every 50 feet. Stalactites and stalagmites, shaped over millennia, reached towards each other like the fingers of long-forgotten gods, yearning for a connection that spanned ages. A fine silt that clung to every crevice and ledge softened the rough textures of the tunnel walls. Nolan tried to pace his breathing through the rebreathing device, careful not to overexert himself in the chilly water. After several minutes of progress through the winding caves, the natural walls gave way to a perfectly straight and smooth passageway, the edges too clean and precise to be natural. Nolan slowed, glancing back at Grace and Doyle. Their eyes met his, reflecting his own surprise at the sudden change. As they swam further into the passage, mysterious etchings and ancient symbols marked the walls, faintly illuminated by the incandescent lights. Nolan's mind raced, struggling to decipher their meaning. He wondered if they told a story or concealed some deeper revelation about this place. As his imagination wandered, he forced himself to focus on escape rather than being delayed by unanswerable questions. There might be time for study later, if they made it to the exit on the other side. They passed other corridors branching off into darkness, passages that could easily become a labyrinth trap for the careless explorer. Nolan tried to make a mental note of each one, despite knowing he'd never be able to retrace their winding route without the lights now guiding them. If the power failed, they would be as good as dead. Around a bend, the passage opened into a slightly larger chamber where he swam past a stone pedestal mounted on the smooth floor. Atop it, a large metal sphere rested, etched with more ancient designs and symbols. He avoided touching it, sensing importance in the way it had been placed intentionally atop the pedestal. He glanced back, seeing Grace admiring it while Doyle moved forward in the passage beyond Nolan. Before Nolan could warn her, Grace reached out and brushed the metal with her hand. The sphere jerked violently as a hidden slit snapped open, revealing a large mechanical eye beneath the shell, its iris dilating rapidly as it swiveled back and forth to focus on them. Grace recoiled in disgust while Nolan stared, mesmerized by its strange, lifelike movement. Suddenly, a deep metallic grinding resonated through the water as 30 feet ahead of them, a huge grated gate crashed down from the passage ceiling with unexpected speed, sealing the corridor in a torrent of bubbles and silt. The barrier stood between them and Doyle. Nolan wrapped his hands around the bars, straining with all his strength, though the bulkhead didn't budge. Beyond the grate, Doyle's eyes looked wide with adrenaline, even as he watched Nolan with a questioning look. Nolan pointed down the passage, signaling Doyle to proceed that way alone, while he and Grace backtracked to retry a side passage. With no other options, Doyle complied, despite his reluctance to split up. Nolan led Grace back the way they had come, retracing their path along the lighted corridor. At the first branching side tunnel, Nolan paused, peering into the gloomy darkness. No lights shone within. It was either retreat all the way back to the sinkhole, or hope this led to another way around. Grace glanced back, nodding, despite her obvious anxiety about whatever unknowns awaited. With no other options, Nolan led them inside. Within the dark tunnel, the blackness enveloping them. He grasped at the rough stone walls, trailing his hand along as they plunged deeper into the unknown, the last wisps of light fading behind them. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating shroud that muffled sound and smothered hope. Nolan focused on controlling his breathing through the rebreather, taking short, panicked gulps of air. The artificial airflow only heightened his growing claustrophobia. He probed ahead blindly with each stroke, dreading the moment his outstretched hands would meet only unyielding stone. Behind him, Grace clung to his suit, her breaths coming in frightened gasps. They passed countless side tunnels, the black water within emitting cold currents against their skin. The icy touch sent spikes of dread through Nolan's nerves. Each new passage taunted them with the threat of becoming lost in this aquatic maze. Nolan's heartbeat roared in his ears. He pressed deeper into the ancient stone artery, refusing to dwell on the thousands of tons of rock and endless ocean pressing down above them. This darkness was more than the absence of light. It had physical weight, a smothering, terrified aliveness that clawed at Nolan's composure. Ahead, his groping fingers met jagged stone, scraping skin. He recoiled before realizing it was a rockfall blocking their path. A dead end. Nolan froze, a cold spike of panic piercing his heart. Dizziness threatened to overwhelm him as the reality of being trapped seized his mind. Grace's fingers dug into his arm, her panic matching his own. Nolan grappled for calm, forcing himself to turn back the way they had come. But dread hounded his thoughts. Without light, even retracing their path was hopeless. They were utterly, terrifyingly lost. Nolan stumbled onward, no longer caring where the tunnel led, as long as it was away from that awful blockade. Time lost meaning. After what seemed like hours, he doubted himself, convinced they had circled back somehow. Despair crushed his thoughts. Then Grace seized his wrist, pushing his hand against the tunnel wall. Metal, one of the conduits. Nolan's spirit soared. The conduits might lead them out. He laid his palm against the cold metal lifeline and hurried forward. The glow started as a dim amber shimmer ahead, which resolved into the underwater lights as the tube led them out of the narrow side passage. Nolan sighed in relief around his rebreather mouthpiece. They emerged into a much larger chamber, the rock ceiling arching overhead. Nolan peered up in surprise to see the shimmering underside of a surface perhaps 15 feet above. Could this be a way out of the tunnels? He held on to Grace, kicking upwards. As they broke the surface, Nolan realized this was something much more wondrous. An enormous underground temple opened up around them. Columns of ornately carved stone soared up into shadow. Stone scraped under Nolan's boots as he crossed the expansive temple chamber, craning his neck to take in the intricate carvings adorning its sloping walls. 4 dark pools marked the perimeter, the water's glassy surface reflecting the ambient amber glow that suffused the room. Nolan's pulse quickened. Whatever powered the lighting in this subterranean maze, it was far beyond ancient. Stone scraped under Nolan's boots as he crossed the expansive temple chamber, craning his neck to take in the intricate carvings adorning its sloping walls. His gaze fell upon the room's central structure, a great stone plinth crowned by a complex mechanical apparatus. Intricately carved gears and conduits interlocked seamlessly, crafted from otherworldly materials. Nolan blinked, struggling to reconcile the device's technological sophistication with the ancient sight surrounding him. As he circled the plinth, entranced by the mystery of the mechanism, his foot caught a rubble-strewn obstruction. Nolan stumbled, threw out a hand to catch himself, and found his palm pressed against cool, smooth bone. Heart lurching, he snatched his hand back. Then he turned to confront what lay at the plinth's base. Entwined together in a final, intimate embrace, lay two human skeletons. They had likely been here for years, if not longer. "What happened to you?" he murmured. As his fingers brushed one skull, the empty socket seemed to stare back. Sorrow pierced Nolan's chest. Snow-white bones contrasted against faded, moss-covered scraps of cloth that might have been suits or uniforms once. Shock rooted him in place as his mind reeled. They appeared to be relics of explorers who had come before. He waved for Grace to join him. "Come look at this," Nolan said. "Who do you think they were?" "Nolan," Grace said, her voice gentle but persistent. "We don't have time for this. We have to keep moving." "Just a second. I want to see something." Nolan kneeled beside the intertwined skeletons, inspecting the remnants of their gear. His eyes widened as he brushed dried sediment off a mission patch on one suit's sleeve, revealing the iconic NASA logo alongside Frontier 1. Nolan's skin prickled. Grace had continued towards the edge of the room, near one of the pools. "Take a look at this." Nolan followed her gaze, landing on an object next to one of the pools. His heart began to race with hope. It was one of the missing rebreathers. He rushed over and examined it. Nearby lay an open container holding flares, a first aid kit, rations, a fully equipped survival pack from the rover. This had to be the exit that led to the pool that he and Eva had found earlier that day. "This is the pool they used to come in," Nolan said, pointing at the skeletal remains. "And it's our way out." Grace nodded as they replaced their rebreathers back into their mouths. Nolan and Grace left the skeletal couple to keep their lonely watch, descending back into the pool located nearest the discarded breathing gear. They swam hard, putting distance between themselves and the temple, whose beauty now masked such tragedy and dark secrets. A single passage led upwards from the chamber into a junction of illuminated tunnels. There they nearly collided with Doyle as he rounded the bend. Joy lit his face at seeing them unharmed. Reunited at last, the group kicked upwards as fast as their legs could piston. Moments later, the smooth, decorated underwater passage gave way to the rough rock and stone of the submerged caverns. And seconds afterwards, Nolan made out the glimmer of the surface above them, beckoning. Hope swelled within him. Nearly there. The three crew members emerged into light, breaching the last barrier between them and salvation. They tore the rebreathers from their mouths, clapping each other on the shoulder in unrestrained relief. They had escaped. The nightmare was over. Or so Nolan thought. Nolan's elation drained as Doyle went rigid, staring over his shoulder in alarm, dread swelling inside him. Nolan turned to follow Doyle's gaze. Just beyond the pool, next to the broken-down rover, the imposing figure of the Watcher stood. The creature observed them with dark, unknowable eyes, its intentions a mystery. Before Nolan could react, Doyle was scrambling away towards the creature. "Where is she? What happened to Eva?" he roared. Doyle hauled himself from the pool and charged across the stone floor towards the towering being, heedless of the potential danger. Chapter 12. 1981. About 18 months before the launch of the ARGO mission, Nolan sat alone on the weathered park bench, overlooking the smooth, black waters of the Osceola River. The first hints of dawn were just beginning to creep over the horizon, casting everything in a dim, pre-daylight glow. He checked his watch again. 5:43 a.m. In a little over 3 hours, he would need to be at Cape Canaveral to report as one of the civilian finalists for the ARGO mission if he still wanted to participate. As he gazed out at the gently flowing river, memories of better times spent in this place washed over him. He had driven here last night, to Riverside Park, hoping the familiar setting would help settle his torrent of thoughts. Or maybe, if he was honest with himself, it was because this place held traces of Annie in every tree and bench. This park had been their special place, where they would spend endless summer days walking the shaded trails, watching sailboats drift by. The bench where Nolan now sat had been their favorite spot. Annie would nestle against him as they spoke for hours. barefoot in the grass, dreaming of a future together. Nolan glanced down at the 2 handwritten letters sitting on the weathered wood next to him, each one a different potential fate sealed and signed. Accept the offer, prepare for the ARGO mission, and launch into the unknown void of space, or walk away from it all and try to rebuild a life with Annie. 2 diverging paths, and Nolan was utterly paralyzed at the crossroads between them. When he had first arrived at the park last night, Nolan was convinced he could make a rational pros and cons list, weighing his options on a worn notebook from his glove compartment. But he had crumpled up failed effort after failed effort until the trash bin was full of discarded choices. His head and his heart were tangled, refusing to follow an orderly line of reason. That's when he had written the letters. Without even realizing it as the words poured out in ink onto the pages, he had drafted 2 versions, one for if he stayed, choosing Annie, and the simple life he had built over the years, flying planes and working on old cars. The other, a heartfelt goodbye if he decided to take the star-bound opportunity and launch himself into the vast unknown. The one truth he kept returning to was that he struggled to envision any sort of future, any version of happiness, without Annie. Even now, when he closed his eyes and tried to picture himself aboard the Frontier spacecraft, Annie's absence felt like a gaping wound threatening to swallow him whole. The mission, as thrilling and history-making as it would be, seemed to pale compared to what he shared with her. With a heavy sigh, Nolan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and took in the landscape, transitioning slowly from night to day. The beams of the rising sun danced across gentle ripples in the dark water. Spanish moss hung in thick curtains from branches of towering live oaks and palms that lined the riverbanks. Nearby, the shrill cry of a great blue heron cut through the quiet. Nolan watched its immense wingspan graze the water's surface as it took flight from a log further down the shore. This place held traces of another life, one where he and Annie would wake early just to watch the sunrise from this bench. He suppressed a painful knot forming in his throat. Whatever decision he made today would irrevocably shape the days yet to be written, for both of them. As the growing light shifted across the landscape, Nolan again checked his watch. 6:04 a.m. Time was slipping by, taunting him. Desperate, he fished a quarter out of his pocket. It glinted as he held it up against the swell of orange at the horizon. "Let fate decide, then," he muttered, taking a deep breath. "Heads, I take this mission, and let the chips fall where they may with her." Nolan's voice caught. Even uttering the idea aloud made his chest constrict with panic. "And tails, I drop out of selection and try to make things work with Annie, wherever life leads us." Nolan balanced the coin on his thumb, steeling himself. Then, with a flick, he sent it spinning, arcing high over the trail. It winked like a tiny metal sun as it crested, then descended. Nolan realized he was holding his breath. Each muscle tensed as he watched the coin's long fall and final bounce along the mulch-scattered path. It struck a coquina rock before rattling out of sight into a tangle of grass. As Nolan pushed himself to his feet, he searched the vegetation for any hint of silver. There, a telltale metallic sheen near the base of a cabbage palm. As Nolan bent down to claim the coin, movement in his periphery gave him pause. Slowly, he lifted his gaze from the undersides of palm fronds. Someone stood at the edge of the path, watching him. All color drained from Nolan's face. "Annie?" he asked, disbelief rooting him to the spot. Was his sleep-deprived, overtaxed mind playing tricks, casting mirages of lost love into the wisps of fog still clinging to the shoreline? But she remained before him, flesh and blood and bittersweet smile. The golden light illuminated her face, glinting off eyes that reflected the same turmoil Nolan himself harbored. Nolan's voice faltered. What could he possibly say? Without a word, Annie approached and bent to retrieve the coin winking from the grass. Her fingers closed around it, brushing Nolan's where they still hovered near the earth. Her touch was cool, but achingly real. She straightened, quarter cradled in her palm, and met Nolan's bewildered stare. Standing this close, He could see faint dark smudges under her eyes to match his own. Neither had found peaceful rest last night. Annie tipped her palm and let the quarter slide into Nolan's open hand. But rather than withdraw, her fingers remained, tracing the lines on his weathered skin. A lifetime of shared history lingered in her touch. Nolan's heart raced. There were no words for this moment. No way to encapsulate all that lay unspoken, yet understood between them. No language could bridge the maelstrom in his chest. So when Annie tilted her face up to his, offering the softest kiss, Nolan answered by pulling her into his embrace. He drew her into a crushing kiss, pushing away his fears, that this could be their last. He tasted the salt of her tears before feeling their damp trail along his own unshaven cheek. When at last their lips parted, Nolan kept his arms around her. "You know, I'll always love you, right?" he whispered. "No matter where I am. Even across the universe." He felt her nod, cheek pressed hard against his chest as though she could meld them into one being, incapable of separation. Behind her, the sun edged over the horizon, kindling the river into liquid fire. The whole park seemed set aglow, the trees and Spanish moss igniting as well. Nolan and Annie stood suspended in that magical moment together. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick. "You don't have to do this for me, Nolan. Whatever you choose has to be your path." With immense effort, Nolan peeled himself away, hands trailing down Annie's arms to clasp her slender hands one last time. He bent to brush a parting kiss on her forehead. "I have to go," he said, the words thick and heavy as lead on his tongue. He released her hands, retrieving one of the envelopes from the bench. "Don't open this until I'm gone, okay?" Mutely, she accepted his letter, holding it loosely at her side. Nolan tucked the other one into his back pocket. With immense effort, he shouldered his pack and turned toward the trail leading back to the parking lot. Each step away from Annie carried the weight of worlds dragging at his heels. He did not, could not, look back for fear he'd falter. By the time Nolan reached his weather-beaten Jeep, the last stars were fading from dawn's rosy canvas. As he swung into his familiar driver's seat, the engine sputtering to life and blues rock filtering out over the radio. Something between sorrow, hope, and anxious excitement tingled down his spine. Nolan pointed the Jeep towards I-95 south as the new day spilled across the Florida landscape. In his rearview mirror, the familiar sight of the park stretched toward the glittering river, and Annie's lone, lovely figure diminished to a shadow on the path's curve. A wilderness of unknowns awaited down the highway, while behind lay love, safety, but also the death of a dream. With a heavy heart, Nolan shifted gears and turned his gaze from the reflection of all he stood to lose. The wheels edged forward, rolling him into a brilliant sunrise. Chapter 13. Present. 5 days after the crash of Ranger 4. Nolan watched as Doyle charged towards the Watcher in a fit of rage, demanding to know what had happened to Eva. "Where is she?" Doyle yelled. "What did you do with her?" The Watcher stepped back cautiously, making no aggressive moves. As Doyle closed in, the creature sidestepped his attack. Doyle stumbled and fell hard onto the damp cave floor with a dull thud that echoed through the vast underground chamber. With unexpected grace, the Watcher pivoted to face the fallen man. Nolan noticed its fur bristling ever so slightly along its neck and arms. Doyle scrambled to his feet and grabbed fistfuls of the Watcher's long fur, but then it easily pushed him away with a sweep of its slender arm. "Doyle!" Nolan called out. "Back off!" But Doyle was beyond reason, consumed by anguish and anger. Once again he charged, and once again the Watcher batted him away with ease. Only this time, the blow sent Doyle sprawling onto his back with a worrisome smack. Nolan winced, but Doyle showed no signs of pain or injury. He jumped back up and lunged at the Watcher yet again. With lightning speed, the Watcher pinned Doyle beneath one of its feet, holding the struggling man fast against the stone floor. Doyle grunted and strained to break free. But the Watcher didn't relent. "Let me go, you freak!" Doyle shouted, pounding his fists against the watcher's leg. It regarded him coldly, unmoved by his outburst. Nolan approached the tense standoff, hands raised in a calming gesture. He needed to defuse the situation before someone got seriously hurt. Out of the corner of his eye, Nolan noticed Grace shifting into a defensive stance, ready to jump in if things escalated. "Easy now," Nolan said. "Just take it easy." The watcher's eyes flicked towards Nolan. Its nostrils flared as it sampled the air. Nolan wondered if it could sense the adrenaline and testosterone hanging thick in the scuffle's wake. Ever so slightly, the pressure of the watcher's foot on Doyle's chest seemed to ease up. Nolan breathed a quiet sigh of relief. He made no sudden moves, taking another step closer. "I know you're scared and confused," he said, maintaining eye contact with the watcher. "We all are. But we don't want to hurt you." Grace spoke up from behind Nolan. "I think it's trying to communicate." Nolan glanced back at her with a puzzled look. "It's hands," Grace said. "Look at the gestures it's making. I think it might be a form of sign language." Nolan returned his gaze to the watcher and studied its long-fingered hands. Sure enough, they waved and signed in strange but deliberate patterns, seemingly directed at the humans. "You're right," Nolan murmured. "It's like it's trying to speak to us." Nolan turned his upper body towards Doyle, making a lowering gesture with his palms. "Let's dial back the testosterone, Doyle," he said. "I don't think this guy means us any harm. Let's see if we can't figure out what he's trying to say." The watcher seemed to observe Nolan's interaction with Doyle, its head cocked to one side. After a moment, it lifted its foot up and away, releasing the fuming man. Doyle shot back up, rage in his eyes, but a stern look from Nolan made him stand down. Doyle stepped back several paces, scowling, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Satisfied that Doyle would not instigate another brawl, Nolan returned his full attention to the watcher. He took a deep breath and spread his arms wide, an invitation of openness and trust. "Okay," Nolan said. "You've clearly been trying hard to communicate with us. What is it you want us to know?" The watcher stared back at him, blinking. It seemed confused or disappointed by Nolan's failure to understand its bizarre gesticulations. With a small chuff of annoyance, it broke eye contact and strode closer to the nearest cave wall. The watcher ran its slender fingers over the prehistoric-looking paintings, peering back at Nolan and the others, beckoning them to come closer with an insistent wave of its furred hand. Exchanging puzzled glances with his companions, Nolan moved to join the watcher by the cave art. As Nolan approached, he puzzled over a sturdy canvas satchel that was slung over the watcher's shoulder, wondering what possessions it might contain. At the watcher's urging, Nolan redirected his attention, scanning the elaborate drawings and symbols. A startling revelation took shape. The scenes covering the walls no longer appeared random. Taken together, they seemed to tell a story, perhaps explaining the origin of this habitat. In one panel, Nolan saw cone-shaped rockets launching from the surface of a vast, domed city, leaving plumes of fire in their wake. Another image depicted the unmistakable silhouette of the Bentham anomaly, floating amidst constellations, backlit by the glow of an enormous, angry-looking star. As Nolan's gaze roamed over the ancient artworks, he noticed the watcher staring at him, as if waiting for him to piece together some elusive epiphany from the symbols. But try as he might, Nolan could not glean the meaning behind the vivid cave murals. With a frustrated huff, the watcher turned and loped further down the curving passage, intent on showing the humans something it deemed important. Uncertain, Nolan followed close behind, Grace and a sullen Doyle trailing along in his wake. Before long, they arrived at what was perhaps the most intricate tableau of all. A sprawling image rendered in red and black pigments, dominating nearly half the cave wall. It was also the most ominous. At the center writhed a seething storm cloud sketched in charcoal and crimson, a malevolent, flowing darkness with smoky tendrils grasping outward in all directions. Nolan felt his body grow cold with recognition. There was no mistaking it. What he saw before him was the exact entity which had emerged from the jungle and snatched Eva away, right before their eyes. "Do you see it?" Doyle choked out. "It's the thing that took her." Nolan barely heard him. The elaborate mural transfixed him, eyes darting from one scene to the next as he took in the story it told. The inky tendrils branched out into a dozen spokes, separating the painting into different segments, each depicting various environments and tableaus. In one wedge, Nolan saw tall structures he took to be skyscrapers in some futuristic city, teeming with tiny humanoid stick figures. Another section portrayed a peaceful garden where similar beings relaxed beneath trees heavy with fruit. In a third portion, he could just make out a laboratory filled with inscrutable equipment and advanced technology. And throughout every environment, the ominous dark tendrils of the cloud-like entity invaded and corrupted, hinted at, but never fully shown, like the threat lurking beneath a calm surface. As Nolan studied the ancient artwork, he sensed the Watcher's expectant gaze boring into him, waiting for that crystallizing moment of understanding it seemed convinced would come. But the more Nolan stared at the elaborate mural, the more elusive its meaning became. There was something here, some vital secret or revelation lurking just beyond his grasp, but he could not tease it out from the cryptic symbology. With a frustrated huff, the Watcher jabbed a clawed finger impatiently at the image of the dark cloud. When Nolan still failed to exhibit that desired flash of insight, the creature's lips peeled back to reveal sharp fangs bared in a sneer of anger. It seemed to glower at the obtuse humans, clearly aggrieved they could not decipher secrets it considered obvious and straightforward. Nolan raised his hands apologetically. "I'm sorry," he offered. "I know this is important, but I honestly have no idea what you're trying to tell us here." The Watcher moved further down the wall, beckoning them to follow, arriving at a different mural. At first glance, the central figure in the drawing didn't look human. It had an elongated head and spindly limbs. But the more Nolan stared at it, the more he realized it bore an uncanny resemblance to the Watcher. The same stylized stick figure appeared at different points within the mural. Nolan realized this was the same figure depicted in various scenes, telling a story. In the first frame, the figure lay in a rectangular box, one of many lined up in rows. Some sort of stasis chamber or cryogenic pod from the looks of it, Nolan thought. In the next frame, the figure was in a laboratory, with what looked like wires and electrodes attached to its head, while other stick figures in lab coats observed. The scene shook Nolan. These did not look like benevolent scientists, but captors experimenting on their subject. In the following frame, the lab was in chaos. Equipment was strewn about, the stick figures in lab coats running in panic as the amorphous black cloud hovered menacingly above them. Nolan felt his chest tighten, a creeping unease coming over him. The next frame depicted the Watcher figure and one lone human fleeing into the jungle foliage. The inky black cloud hot on their heels, its smoky tendrils engulfing the other humans left behind. A possible history documenting the Watcher's emancipation and escape, Nolan thought. But also a warning. Whatever they had fled from remained a threat. Nolan turned to the Watcher and pointed at the painted figure disappearing into the trees, then pointed at the Watcher. "Is this you?" Nolan asked. The Watcher stared back and nodded, raising his long-fingered hand to point at himself, then at the depicted figure, confirming Nolan's suspicion. Nolan's mind reeled. Clearly, the paintings told the history of the Watcher's people and this habitat they found themselves stranded in. Then, the Watcher did something unexpected. He pointed at the lone human accompanying him in the painting. Then he pointed at Nolan. Nolan frowned, not understanding. He pointed at himself and shook his head. "I think he's saying that human is supposed to be you," Grace offered, perplexed. Impossible, Nolan thought. But the Watcher kept gesturing from the human to Nolan, insisting on some connection. "How can that be me? That was painted long ago before any of us arrived here," Nolan protested. The Watcher tilted his head as if puzzling over Nolan's tone. Then he took Nolan gently but firmly by the arm and led him further down the wall to the next frame. It depicted the lone human seated beside the Watcher figure in the jungle. The painted image of the Watcher held a boxy object to its mouth, emitting wavy lines, some kind of sound waves. Before Nolan could make sense of the scene, the watcher produced the harmonica from his canvas satchel and held it up, pointing at it, then to the sound waves in the image. Understanding flashed in Nolan's mind. "I think this stick figure is playing a harmonica, my harmonica," he uttered in disbelief. "I don't think that's just any stick figure, Nolan," Doyle said. "But how could ancient cave paintings show you here before you even arrived?" Nolan shook his head. The watcher replaced the harmonica and took Nolan's wrist again, more insistently this time. He led them 30 paces further to the huge sealed metal door recessed into the rocky wall. Nolan noted the deep gashes marring the metal. He pictured the watcher trying to claw his way through. Why was this door so important to unlock? The watcher hurried to a small utility box beside the door and swung it open, bathing his face in the red light emanating from within. There was a smooth glass panel inside. He looked at Nolan. There was an urgency in his gaze that made Nolan uneasy. "I think it needs a handprint to open," Doyle said, stepping forward. He placed his palm on the glass surface inside the box. It flickered to life, scanning his hand before blinking red. Nothing happened. The watcher jabbed his spindly finger towards Nolan, beckoning him to try instead. Nolan hesitated briefly. Something about opening this sealed door filled him with foreboding. But he swallowed his reservations and pressed his hand to the panel. The red glow intensified, illuminating his palm. For a heart-stopping second, there was only silence. Then a low, mechanical groan rumbled through the rock. The massive door began sliding open as everyone stepped back. "Well done, golden boy," Doyle quipped. "How come you're the only one it recognizes?" But Nolan barely registered Doyle's words, his eyes fixed on the doorway, now gaping open, leading down into a dim, unlit hallway. Before he could peer deeper inside, the watcher sprang through the opening and disappeared from view. Nolan stood frozen as his eyes adjusted. Details began resolving from rooms beyond the hallway. From the shadows he saw floor tiles, glass cylinders, benches strewn with unfamiliar implements and equipment. He realized with dawning unease that he was looking into some kind of laboratory, just like the paintings in the cave. Heart thudding, Nolan stepped over the threshold into the space beyond. Doyle and Grace followed close behind. The watcher stood 10 paces ahead, regarding them expectantly, waiting for them before proceeding deeper inside. With the paintings fresh in his mind, Nolan suddenly wanted to flee this place and seal it off forever. Nolan took a deep breath to steady his nerves, stepping forward into the shadows. Chapter 14. Nolan took in the sight of the wide hallway as he walked into the dim space. Doyle called out that he found the light switch, and a moment later, brilliant lights flooded the surroundings, revealing a clinical corridor that contrasted with its ransacked appearance. The impression was clear. This space had once been orderly, almost sterile, with a long central hallway lined by at least a dozen rooms on either side. The smooth flooring, metallic doors, and windowed lab rooms reminded Nolan of a hospital. But this was no ordinary medical complex. The advanced equipment barely visible through dusty glass, the restricted access and hidden underground location, all hinted at intertwined secrets of both healing and discovery. "What is this place?" Nolan muttered. Doyle shrugged without answering, his gaze roving over the chaos of papers, tools, and debris littering the hallway floor. It was as if the personnel here had dropped everything at a moment's notice. A single shoe lay on its side, forlorn. Nolan felt an uneasy twinge in his gut. The watcher had already bounded far ahead down the corridor and disappeared through a large doorway at the end. Nolan hesitated, then approached the nearest lab room window to get a better look inside. "I know we all want answers about this place and why the watcher led us here," Nolan said in a hushed voice. "But keep your eyes open. We have no clue what to expect down here." "What in heaven's name do you think this place is?" Doyle wondered aloud, peering into one of the rooms. Nolan hardly glanced at the particulars of that lab, his attention drawn farther down the hall. He moved towards the first doorway, which had a plaque next to it labeled Genetic Research Lab A4. His eyes widened as he took in the expanse of equipment within. At the room's center sat an imposing surgical table made of gleaming stainless steel. Thick leather straps hung from its sides, hinting at a purpose Nolan didn't want to imagine. The surrounding computer stations had screens displaying DNA helix models and microscope images of unrecognizable cells. Along the back wall stood rows of glass cylinders, each filled with a preserving gel, and a small, unlabeled biological sample. A fur-covered hand floated in the nearest cylinder. Nolan swallowed hard, a knot forming in his stomach. What kind of research had these people been conducting? Was it simple science or something far more twisted? The lab itself was in chaos, drawers flung open, papers and broken glass littering the floor, the computer screens flickering. It was as if some violent struggle had broken out, interrupting the researchers' work and lives without warning. What had they feared in those final moments? What had they been rushing to protect or conceal? Unease creeping through his nerves, Nolan turned away from the room. Down the hall, Grace called out, telling them they had to come see what she'd found. Glad for the distraction, Nolan and Doyle hurried to meet her, asking what it was. Her face lit up with excitement as she waved them over. "I found a storage room full of supplies," she exclaimed. Nolan and Doyle stepped across the threshold into the small room and saw why Grace was so excited. 2 walls were filled ceiling to floor with shelves stocked with every kind of packaged, non-perishable food imaginable, from protein packs to freeze-dried fruits and vegetables that would last for decades, without refrigeration. "Is that chocolate?" Grace gasped, grabbing a foil-wrapped bar from a shelf and tearing it open. She took a bite and sighed. "It's actually real chocolate." Nolan allowed himself an amused half-smile at her sweet-toothed delight, before taking in the rest of the room's contents. The shelves along the third wall were stocked from top to bottom with medical supplies, drugs, ointments, bandages, IV bags, and unknown substances in sterile packaging. A raw, anguished cry interrupted his thoughts, echoing from somewhere down the dim hallway. Inhuman tones layered the sound. There was profound sorrow and loss in that voice. "What the heck was that?" Doyle said. "Let's go check it out. But stay behind me," Nolan replied. Nolan exchanged an uneasy look with the others, moving back into the central corridor, peering down toward the large metal door where the watcher had gone. The cry had definitely originated from that room. What had it found down there to elicit such grief? As they made their way forward, Nolan's sense of foreboding grew. About halfway down, Doyle gave a low, impressed whistle and waved Nolan over toward one of the rooms. Nolan peered inside, seeing that it was filled wall to wall with firearms, handguns, rifles, and rows of ammunition. A fully stocked armory. "Well, now we know why they needed all those medical supplies," Doyle commented. "Sure, looks like they were prepared for serious trouble. Or maybe they were the trouble." Nolan just frowned, a chilly feeling settling in his gut. What had the people here been involved with? Why the hidden underground base with secret labs, isolated quarantine rooms, enough weapons for a small army? Unease still prickling his spine, Nolan turned away from the weapons cache and continued towards the partially open door ahead. Carefully, he nudged it farther ajar. As the heavy door swung wider, cool air flowed out along with a gentle blue glow. Nolan squared his shoulders, stepping inside. He froze, eyes going wide as the vast space revealed itself to him. He'd realized this room was sizable from outside, but had underestimated its scale. It was the size of a small warehouse. "Stasis pods," he muttered. "Dozens of them." His gaze traveled over the rows of pods, sleek, metallic rectangles twice as tall as a man, and emitting an ethereal blue glow from their bases. They were identical, except for the one factor that sent a spike of shock through his system. Through each small window was clearly visible an elongated, slender-limbed humanoid form. The proportions were slightly off, limbs a bit too gangly, neck curved forward a bit too much, face a bit too wide. But there was no mistaking it. Each pod held the immobilized body of a watcher, the same species, as their guide. "There must be 40, 50 of them here." Doyle breathed as he moved further into the room. His voice was hushed, awed. He stepped closer to the nearest pod, observing the visage behind the thick glass. The watcher's face was serene, eyes closed as if in deep sleep. A mask covered the lower half of its face, likely providing sustenance and sedation to maintain the stasis lock. Displays on the side of the pod monitored vitals. A handful showed warning lights, but most glowed a steady, calm blue. "Are they all in stasis?" Doyle asked. "Why? Is it for travel, like with the Frontier launch?" Nolan just shook his head. "I don't know. But look here." He pointed to one screen that showed a rotating double helix strand. They were studying the Watcher's genetics, decoding their DNA. I think this was some kind of research facility. An icy feeling settled in his stomach as the implication sank in. Doyle frowned, clearly coming to the same conclusion Nolan had. Researching an intelligent species against their will? What exactly happened here? Nolan spotted the Watcher standing over one of the pods. One leathery hand pressed flat to the glass surface of the pod. The creature was utterly still, yet seemed coiled with intensity. Then a sound pierced the heavy silence, an anguished, keening wail that echoed around the cavernous space. Nolan froze, startled by the sudden eruption of sound. The Watcher did not seem to register Nolan's presence, continuing to unleash its grief in a series of cries that spoke of unbearable loss. Nolan observed, pinned in place by the rawness of the Watcher's sorrow. He felt an unexpected swell of compassion for this strange being. In a moment of clarity, he knew with sudden certainty that the pod before the Watcher contained someone profoundly dear, a mate, perhaps, imprisoned and lost to a lifetime of separation. The Watcher dragged its claws down the glass in a futile attempt at contact before dissolving once more into wretched sobs. The sound gripped Nolan's heart with sadness. An urge rose within him to offer some small measure of comfort to this creature. Unsure how to even approach something so wholly alien in its grief, Nolan took a careful step back towards the doorway through which he had entered. Back in the central corridor, Nolan wandered past laboratories where equipment sat abandoned mid-experiment. He trailed his fingers over counters messy with papers, instruments, and glassware. Remnants of research interrupted and never resumed. What had happened here to make them flee so quickly, leaving everything behind? Across the hall, Nolan noticed an open doorway with a soft glow spilling out of it. He crossed the corridor and peeked inside. His eyes widened. The room held half a dozen workstations, each with multiple advanced computer terminals. Cool blue light emanated from the monitor's smooth surfaces. Nolan drifted inside, drawn by technology far beyond anything he'd seen on Earth. As he slid into one of the chairs, the screens brightened, sensing his presence. As he ran his hands over the controls, Grace entered behind him, munching on a bag of pretzels scavenged from the storage bay. "You found the control room," she remarked. "Seems that way." Grace nodded at the screens. "Anything interesting?" Nolan gestured. "I can't make sense of most of it." "See if you can use your handprint to unlock it," she suggested through a mouthful, pointing to a palm-sized glass panel. "Worked on the main door, didn't it?" Nolan pressed his right hand to the pad. Instantly, the monitors blinked out of standby mode in a welcoming chime. "Welcome, Nolan Beckett," a pleasant computer voice said as the software booted up, revealing a user interface labeled in English. Taken aback, Nolan's gaze roamed over graphs, diagrams, and a stream of icons. He hesitated, then reached toward a panel near the screens. One read logs, another communications, a third security. Grace perused the icons. When she spotted security, her eyes lit up mischievously. "Ooh, what do we have here?" She tapped the icon. The display rippled, then resolved into a grid of video feeds. Camera views of different sectors of the habitat filled the screens. Some kind of central tower, a hydroponic farm, power facilities, even the wreckage of their ship along the beach. "It's like their own surveillance network," Nolan mused. "I'll say, makes you wonder what they were so worried about." Nolan skimmed through the feeds. It was jarring to see so many familiar areas through the habitat's pervasive security system. He imagined their ordeal playing out from this remote, omniscient perspective. One feed showed the beach where the crew had crash-landed. Nolan enlarged it, staring grimly at the spot where they'd found Annika broken and bleeding in the waves. Grace followed his gaze and exhaled. Does it rewind? I think so. Let's see. Nolan manipulated the controls until the timestamp read roughly when they'd arrived. The video rolled. The empty beach, quiet waves. Then their Ranger 4 shuttle plummeting from the sky, crashing in a maelstrom of sand and surf. The crew spilled across the beach, unmoving. Nolan spotted his own unconscious form, battered in the waves. The video quality was unnervingly clear. Does it have audio? Grace whispered. I don't want to know. Nolan exited the feed, queasy. As he backed out of the feed and the grid of thumbnail views returned, a blur of movement caught his eye. He tapped the relevant screen. It expanded to show a small medical bay, surprisingly similar to the labs within the facility they were exploring. Grace leaned over his shoulder, peering at the screen. Wait. Pan left. Nolan obeyed. As he panned the camera, a different room swam into view. There. Grace jabbed a finger at the screen. Nolan focused on the new room, clinical, compact. At its center, a woman lay still on a hospital bed, dressed in a medical gown, blankets drawn to her waist. No. It can't be. Nolan choked. It's Annika. He gripped the console, eyes glued to Annika's sleeping form. The steady rise and fall of her chest was infinitely reassuring after the ordeal she had been through on the beach. Grace shook her head in wonder. Son of a gun. She made it. They watched as Eva entered the frame. She paused to review notes on a tablet before moving to adjust the IV drip next to Annika's bed. Then Marcus appeared briefly to speak with Eva before they both turned and exited the room. Where are they? Nolan said. Is that facility somewhere else in the habitat? Possible, Grace mused. Sure as heck looks a lot cleaner than this place. Nolan's mind raced. Annika was out there, recovering under Eva's care. After what happened to her, how could Eva be so calm? How did Marcus fit in? Questions tumbled through his thoughts, unanswered. His hands curled into fists against the console. Abruptly, a new message box popped up on the screen. Incoming video transmission. Do you want to accept? He looked at Grace. She raised her eyebrows and shrugged. Taking a breath, Nolan accepted. The video feed minimized into the corner, and a new image filled the screens. The face of a young girl, perhaps 5 years old. She had auburn hair that fell loose about her shoulders. Her piercing blue eyes went wide at the sight of Nolan. She gasped, Daddy. Nolan froze, breath arrested in his throat. The girl broke into a dazzling, gap-toothed grin that dimpled her freckled cheeks. Daddy, are you back? Nolan worked his mouth, but no sound came. His heart hammered against his ribs. Daddy? Him? How? At his stunned silence, the girl tipped her head. Why aren't you saying anything? Nolan faltered. I don't... Grace gripped his shoulder. Nolan, do you know her? She hissed under her breath. He shook his head minutely, still floored into silence. The girl's brow pinched in concern. Daddy? Are you okay? Nolan forced himself to take a shaky breath. I'm sorry. I'm just... He rubbed a hand over his jaw, utterly lost. What's your name? He finally managed. The girl giggled as if this were a game. It's me, silly. Ada. Nolan murmured the name to himself, testing it. Ada. It sounded... right, somehow. Musical. His heart constricted in his chest. Oh. The girl, Ada, suddenly perked up. If you're back, I should get Mommy. She's going to be so excited. Before Nolan could respond, Ada had turned away from the screen and shouted, Mommy! Daddy's on the phone! Her bright voice cut through Nolan like a knife. Daddy. Mommy. His mind reeled, grappling desperately for an explanation, because if this girl was telling the truth... Grace reached out and gripped Nolan's shoulder. Her eyes were wide, face pale. "Nolan," she whispered. "Could she be... yours?" The thought threatened to crack something open inside him. Nolan felt the color drain from his face. "I don't know, He shook his head. "Why can't I remember?" But even as he denied it, half-formed memories teased at the edges of his consciousness. Impressions of laughter, a brush of copper hair against his cheek, small hands folded trustingly in his... Ada looked over her shoulder, listening to a muffled off-screen voice, her mother's voice. When she turned back around, her eyes brimmed with excitement. "Mommy's coming!" Nolan gripped the console, willing himself not to shake. Mommy. Then this was real, which meant he was a father, had a family here, somewhere. Impossible. But the longer he stared at this girl, at his daughter, the more something fundamental inside him cried out in recognition. In the background of the video call, alarms began blaring. Ada's smile faded, replaced by confusion and concern. Flashing red emergency lights flooded her surroundings. The same off-screen voice called out. Nolan surged forward, as if he could reach through the screen. "Ada! Ada!" But the video feed had begun to deteriorate. The image jerked and twisted sickeningly. For a brief moment, the camera seemed to have fallen, and in the background, the image briefly settled on a blocky logo. In big letters, it read, "Magnus." Nolan was afforded an upside-down glimpse of a woman racing toward Ada before the screen cut to harsh static. "No! No!" Nolan slammed a fist onto the console, breath ragged. The blank screen stared back. He whipped around to Grace. "What in the world just happened?" She raised her hands, looking as gutted as he felt. A notification pinged. Nolan spun back to the screens. The security camera view of Annika's room had replaced the static. She continued to sleep. Nolan braced himself against the console, hanging his head. His mind raced to process what had just happened. Who was Ada? How did she know him? Why did it feel like his heart was being wrenched from his chest? He shook his head, as if he could cast this off like an unwanted dream. "That girl," he rasped. "She called me her father." He looked at Grace beseechingly. She hesitated, then squeezed his shoulder. "Yeah," she said, "but why? And what is Magnus?"